This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark Nelson. The Beast with 5 Fingers by William F. Harvey. When I was a little boy, I once went with my father to call on Adrian Borlsover. I played on the floor with the black spaniel, while my father appealed for a subscription. Just before we left, my father said, "Mr. Borlsover, may my son here shake hands with you? It will be a thing to look back upon with pride when he grows to be a man." I came up to the bed on which the old man was lying, and put my hand in his, awed by the still beauty of his face. He spoke to me kindly, and hoped that I should always try to please my father. Then he placed his right hand on my head, and asked for a blessing to rest upon me. "Amen," said my father, and I followed him out of the room, feeling as if I wanted to cry. But my father was in excellent spirits. "That old gentleman, Jim," said he, "is the most wonderful man in the whole town. For 10 years he has been quite blind." "But I saw his eyes," I said. "They were ever so black and shiny. They weren't shut up like Nora's puppies. Can't he see at all?" And so I learnt for the first time that a man might have eyes that looked dark and beautiful and shining without being able to see. "Just like Mrs. Tomlinson has big ears," I said, "and can't hear at all except when Mr. Tomlinson shouts." "Jim," said my father, "it's not right to talk about a lady's ears. Remember what Mr. Borlsover said about pleasing me and being a good boy." That was the only time I saw Adrian Borlsover. I soon forgot about him and the hand which he laid in blessing on my head. But for a week I prayed that those dark, tender eyes might see. "His spaniel may have puppies," I said in my prayers, "and he will never be able to see how funny they look with their eyes all closed up. Please, let old Mr. Borlsover see." Adrian Borlsover, as my father had said, was a wonderful man. He came of an eccentric family. Borlsover's sons, for some reason, always seemed to marry very ordinary women, which perhaps accounted for the fact that no Borlsover had been a genius, and only one Borlsover had been mad. But they were great champions of little causes, generous patrons of odd sciences, founders of querulous sects, trustworthy guides to the bypath meadows of erudition. Adrian was an authority on the fertilization of orchids. He had held at one time the family living at Borlsover Conyers, until a congenital weakness of the lungs obliged him to seek a less rigorous climate in the sunny south coast watering-place where I had seen him. Occasionally he would relieve one or other of the local clergy. My father described him as a fine preacher, who gave long and inspiring sermons from what many men would have considered unprofitable texts. "An excellent proof," he would add, "of the truth of the doctrine of direct verbal inspiration." Adrian Borlsover was exceedingly clever with his hands. His penmanship was exquisite. He illustrated all his scientific papers, made his own woodcuts, and carved the reredos that is at present the chief feature of interest in the church at Borlsover Conyers. He had an exceedingly clever knack in cutting silhouettes for young ladies, and paper pigs and cows for little children, and made more than one complicated wind instrument of his own devising. When he was 50 years old, Adrian Borlsover lost his sight. In a wonderfully short time he had adapted himself to the new conditions of life. He quickly learned to read Braille. So marvelous indeed was his sense of touch that he was still able to maintain his interest in botany. The mere passing of his long, supple fingers over a flower was sufficient means for its identification, though occasionally he would use his lips. I have found several letters of his among my father's correspondence. In no case was there anything to show that he was afflicted with blindness, and this in spite of the fact that he exercised undue economy in the spacing of lines. Towards the close of his life, the old man was credited with powers of touch that seemed almost uncanny. It has been said that he could tell at once the color of a ribbon placed between his fingers. My father would neither confirm nor deny the story. Adrian Borlsover was a bachelor. His elder brother George had married late in life, leaving one son, Eustace, who lived in the gloomy Georgian mansion at Borlsover Conyers, where he could work undisturbed in collecting material for his great book on heredity. Like his uncle, he was a remarkable man. The Borlsovers had always been born naturalists, but Eustace possessed in a special degree the power of systematizing his knowledge. He had received his university education in Germany, and then, after postgraduate work in Vienna and Naples, had traveled for 4 years in South America and the East, getting together a huge store of material for a new study into the processes of variation. He lived alone at Borlsover Conyers, with Saunders, his secretary, a man who bore a somewhat dubious reputation in the district, but whose powers as a mathematician, combined with his business abilities, were invaluable to Eustace. Uncle and nephew saw little of each other. The visits of Eustace were confined to a week in the summer or autumn, long weeks that dragged almost as slowly as the bath chair in which the old man was drawn along the sunny sea-front. In their way, the two men were fond of each other, though their intimacy would doubtless have been greater had they shared the same religious views. Adrian held to the old-fashioned evangelical dogmas of his early manhood. His nephew, for many years, had been thinking of embracing Buddhism. Both men possessed, too, the reticence the Borlsovers had always shown, and which their enemies sometimes called hypocrisy. With Adrian it was a reticence as to the things he had left undone. But with Eustace it seemed that the curtain which he was so careful to leave undrawn hid something more than a half-empty chamber. 2 years before his death, Adrian Borlsover developed, unknown to himself, the not uncommon power of automatic writing. Eustace made the discovery by accident. Adrian was sitting reading in bed, the forefinger of his left hand tracing the Braille characters, when his nephew noticed that a pencil the old man held in his right hand was moving slowly along the opposite page. He left his seat in the window and sat down beside the bed. The right hand continued to move, and now he could see plainly that they were letters and words which it was forming. Adrian Borlsover, wrote the hand. Eustace Borlsover, George Borlsover, Francis Borlsover, Sigismund Borlsover, Adrian Borlsover, Eustace Borlsover, Saville Borlsover, B for Borlsover, honesty is the best policy, beautiful Belinda Borlsover. What a curious nonsense, said Eustace to himself. King George III ascended the throne in 1760, wrote the hand. Crowd, a noun of multitude, a collection of individuals. Adrian Borlsover, Eustace Borlsover. It seems to me, said his uncle, closing the book, that you had better make the most of the afternoon sunshine and take your walk now. I think perhaps I will, Eustace answered as he picked up the volume. I won't go far, and when I come back I can read to you those articles in Nature about which we were speaking. He went along the promenade, but stopped at the first shelter, and seating himself in the corner best protected from the wind, he examined the book at leisure. Nearly every page was scored with a meaningless jungle of pencil marks, rows of capital letters, short words, long words, complete sentences, copybook tags. The whole thing, in fact, had the appearance of a copybook, and on a more careful scrutiny Eustace thought that there was ample evidence to show that the handwriting at the beginning of the book, good though it was not nearly so good as the handwriting at the end. He left his uncle at the end of October, with a promise to return in early December. It seemed to him quite clear that the old man's power of automatic writing was developing rapidly, and for the first time he looked forward to a visit that combined duty with interest. But on his return he was at first disappointed. His uncle, he thought, looked older. He was listless, too, preferring others to read to him and dictating nearly all his letters. Not until the day before he left had Eustace an opportunity of observing Adrian Borlsover's new-found faculty. The old man, propped up in bed on pillows, had sunk into a light sleep. His two hands lay on the coverlet, his left hand tightly clasping his right. Eustace took an empty manuscript book and placed a pencil within reach of the fingers of the right hand. They snatched at it eagerly, then dropped the pencil to unloose the left hand from its restraining grasp. "Perhaps to prevent interference I had better hold that hand," said Eustace to himself as he watched the pencil. Almost immediately it began to write. "Blundering Borlsovers, unnecessarily unnatural, extraordinarily eccentric, culpably curious." "Who are you?" asked Eustace in a low voice. "Never you mind," wrote the hand of Adrian. "Is it my uncle who is writing?" "Oh, my prophetic soul, mine uncle." "Is it anyone I know?" "Silly Eustace, you'll see me very soon." "When shall I see you?" "When poor old Adrian's dead." "Where shall I see you?" "Where shall you not?" Instead of speaking his next question, Borlsover wrote it. "What is the time?" The fingers dropped the pencil and moved 3 or 4 times across the paper. Then, picking up the pencil, they wrote, 10 minutes before 4. Put your book away, Eustace. Adrian mustn't find us working at this sort of thing. He doesn't know what to make of it, and I won't have poor old Adrian disturbed. Au revoir." Adrian Borlsover awoke with a start. "I've been dreaming again," he said. "Such queer dreams of leaguered cities and forgotten towns. You were mixed up in this one, Eustace, though I can't remember how. Eustace, I want to warn you. Don't walk in doubtful paths. Choose your friends well. Your poor grandfather—" A fit of coughing put an end to what he was saying, but Eustace saw that the hand was still writing. He managed unnoticed to draw the book away. "I'll light the gas," he said, "and ring for tea." On the other side of the bed curtain he saw the last sentences that had been written. "It's too late, Adrian," he read. "We're friends already, aren't we, Eustace Borlsover?" On the following day Eustace Borlsover left. He thought his uncle looked ill when he said good-bye, and the old man spoke despondently of the failure his life had been. "Nonsense, uncle," said his nephew. "You have got over your difficulties in a way not 1 in 100,000 would have done. Everyone marvels at your splendid perseverance in teaching your hand to take the place of your lost sight. To me it's been a revelation of the possibilities of education." "Education," said his uncle dreamily, as if the word had started a new train of thought. "Education is good so long as you know to whom and for what purpose you give it. But with the lower orders of men, the base and more sordid spirits, I have grave doubts as to its results. Well, good-bye, Eustace. I may not see you again. You are a true Borlsover, with all the Borlsover faults. Marry, Eustace. Marry some good, sensible girl. And if by any chance I don't see you again, my will is at my solicitor's. I've not left you any legacy, because I know you're well provided for, but I thought you might like to have my books. Oh, and there's just one other thing. You know, before the end, people often lose control over themselves and make absurd requests. Don't pay any attention to them, Eustace. Good-bye." And he held out his hand. Eustace took it. It remained in his a fraction of a second longer than he had expected, and gripped him with a virility that was surprising. There was, too, in its touch, a subtle sense of intimacy. "Why, uncle," he said, "I shall see you alive and well for many long years to come." 2 months later, Adrian Borlsover died. Eustace Borlsover was in Naples at the time. He read the obituary notice in the Morning Post on the day announced for the funeral. "Poor old fellow," he said. I wonder where I shall find room for all his books. The question occurred to him again with greater force when 3 days later he found himself standing in the library at Borlsover Conyers, a huge room built for use, and not for beauty, in the year of Waterloo by a Borlsover who was an ardent admirer of the great Napoleon. It was arranged on the plan of many college libraries, with tall, projecting bookcases forming deep recesses of dusty silence, fit graves for the old hates of forgotten controversy, the dead passions of forgotten lives. At the end of the room, behind the bust of some unknown 18th-century divine, an ugly iron corkscrew stair led to a shelf-lined gallery. Nearly every shelf was full. "I must talk to Saunders about it," said Eustace. "I suppose that it will be necessary to have the billiard-room fitted up with bookcases." The two men met for the first time after many weeks in the dining-room that evening. "Hullo," said Eustace, standing before the fire with his hands in his pockets. "How goes the world, Saunders? Why these dress togs?" He himself was wearing an old shooting-jacket. He did not believe in mourning, as he had told his uncle on his last visit, and though he usually went in for quiet-colored ties, he wore this evening one of an ugly red, in order to shock Morton the butler, and to make them thrash out the whole question of mourning for themselves in the servants' hall. Eustace was a true Borlsover. "The world," said Saunders, "goes the same as usual, confoundedly slow. These dress togs are accounted for by an invitation from Captain Lockwood to bridge." "How are you getting there?" "I've told your coachman to drive me in your carriage. Any objection?" "Oh, dear me, no. We've had all things in common for far too many years for me to raise objections at this hour of the day." "You'll find your correspondence in the library," went on Saunders. "Most of it I've seen to. There are a few private letters I haven't opened. There's also a box with a rat or something inside it that came by the evening post. Very likely it's the six-toed albino. I didn't look because I didn't want to mess up my things, but I should gather from the way it's jumping about that it's pretty hungry." "Oh, I'll see to it," said Eustace, "while you and the captain earn an honest penny." Dinner over and Saunders gone, Eustace went into the library. Though the fire had been lit, the room was by no means cheerful. "We'll have all the lights on, at any rate," he said, as he turned the switches. "And Morton," he added, when the butler brought the coffee, "get me a screwdriver or something to undo this box. Whatever the animal is, he's kicking up a deuce of a row. What is it? Why are you dawdling?" "If you please, sir, when the postman brought it, he told me that they'd bored the holes in the lid at the post-office. There were no breathing holes in the lid, sir, and they didn't want the animal to die. That is all, sir." "It's culpably careless of the man, whoever he was," said Eustace, as he removed the screws. "Packing an animal like this in a wooden box with no means of getting air. Confound it all, I meant to ask Morton to bring me a cage to put it in. Now I suppose I shall have to get one myself." He placed a heavy book on the lid from which the screws had been removed, and went into the billiard-room. As he came back into the library with an empty cage in his hand, he heard the sound of something falling, and then of something scuttling along the floor. "Bother it, the beast's got out. How in the world am I going to find it again in this library?" To search for it did indeed seem hopeless. He tried to follow the sound of the scuttling in one of the recesses where the animal seemed to be running behind the books in the shelves, but it was impossible to locate it. Eustace resolved to go on quietly reading. Very likely the animal might gain confidence and show itself. Saunders seemed to have dealt in his usual methodical manner with most of the correspondence. There were still the private letters. What was that? 2 sharp clicks, and the lights in the hideous candelabra that hung from the ceiling suddenly went out. "I wonder if something has gone wrong with the fuse," said Eustace, as he went to the switches by the door. Then he stopped. There was a noise at the other end of the room, as if something was crawling up the iron corkscrew stair. "If it's gone into the gallery," he said, "well and good." He hastily turned on the lights, crossed the room, and climbed up the stair. But he could see nothing. His grandfather had placed a little gate at the top of the stair, so that children could run and romp in the gallery without fear of accident. This Eustace closed, and having considerably narrowed the circle of his search, returned to his desk by the fire. How gloomy the library was! There was no sense of intimacy about the room. The few busts that an 18th-century Borlsover had brought back from the grand tour might have been in keeping in the old library. Here they seemed out of place. They made the room feel cold, in spite of the heavy red damask curtains and the great gilt cornices. With a crash 2 heavy books fell from the gallery to the floor. Then, as Borlsover looked, another, and yet another. "Very well, you'll starve for this, my beauty," he said. "We'll do some little experiments on the metabolism of rats deprived of water. Go on, chuck them down. I think I've got the upper hand." He returned once again to his correspondence. The letter was from the family solicitor. It spoke of his uncle's death and of the valuable collection of books that had been left to him in the will. There was one request, he read, which certainly came as a surprise to me. As you know, Mr. Adrian Borlsover had left instructions that his body was to be buried in as simple a manner as possible at Eastbourne. He expressed a desire that there should be neither wreaths nor flowers of any kind, and hoped that his friends and relatives would not consider it necessary to wear mourning. The day before his death we received a letter cancelling these instructions. He wished his body to be embalmed. He gave us the address of the man we were to employ, Pennifer, Ludgate Hill, with orders that his right hand was to be sent to you, stating that it was at your special request. The other arrangements as to the funeral remained unaltered. "Good Lord," said Eustace, "what in the world was the old boy driving at? And what in the name of all that's holy is that?" Someone was in the gallery. Someone had pulled the cord attached to one of the blinds, and it had rolled up with a snap. Someone must be in the gallery, for a second blind did the same. Someone must be walking round the gallery, for one after the other the blinds sprang up, letting in the moonlight. "I haven't got to the bottom of this yet," said Eustace, "but I will do before the night is very much older," and he hurried up the corkscrew stair. He had just got to the top when the lights went out a second time, and he heard again the scuttling along the floor. Quickly he stole on tiptoe in the dim moonshine in the direction of the noise, feeling as he went for one of the switches. His fingers touched the metal knob at last. He turned on the electric light. About 10 yards in front of him, crawling along the floor, was a man's hand. Eustace stared at it in utter astonishment. It was moving quickly, in the manner of a geometer caterpillar. The fingers humped up one moment, flattened out the next. The thumb appeared to give a crab-like motion to the whole. While he was looking, too surprised to stir, the hand disappeared round the corner. Eustace ran forward. He no longer saw it, but he could hear it as it squeezed its way behind the books on one of the shelves. A heavy volume had been displaced. There was a gap in the row of books where it had got in. In his fear lest it should escape him again, he seized the first book that came to his hand and plugged it into the hole. Then, emptying 2 shelves of their contents, he took the wooden boards and propped them up in front to make his barrier doubly sure. "I wish Saunders was back," he said. "One can't tackle this sort of thing alone." It was after 11, and there seemed little likelihood of Saunders returning before 12. He did not dare to leave the shelf unwatched, even to run downstairs to ring the bell. Morton, the butler, often used to come round about 11 to see that the windows were all fastened, but he might not come. Eustace was thoroughly unstrung. At last he heard steps down below. "Morton!" he shouted. "Morton!" "Sir?" "Has Saunders got back yet?" "Not yet, sir." "Well, bring me some brandy, and hurry up about it. I'm up here in the gallery, you duffer." "Thanks," said Eustace, as he emptied the glass. "Don't go to bed yet, Morton. There are a lot of books that have fallen down by accident. Bring them up and put them back in their shelves." Morton had never seen Borlsover in so talkative a mood as on that night. "Here," said Eustace when the books had been put back and dusted. "You might hold up these boards for me, Morton. The beast in the box got out, and I've been chasing it all over the place." "I think I can hear it chawing at the books, sir. They're not valuable, I hope." "I think that's the carriage, sir. I'll go down and call Mr. Saunders." It seemed to Eustace that he was away for 5 minutes, but it could hardly have been more than one when he returned with Saunders. "All right, Morton, you can go now. I'm up here, Saunders." "What's all the row?" asked Saunders as he lounged forward with his hands in his pockets. The luck had been with him all evening. He was completely satisfied, both with himself and with Captain Lockwood's taste in wines. "What's the matter? You look to me to be in an absolute blue funk." "That old devil of an uncle of mine," began Eustace. "Oh, I can't explain it all. It's his hand that's been playing old Harry all evening. But I've got it cornered behind these books. You've got to help me catch it." "What's up with you, Eustace? What's the game?" "It's no game, you silly idiot. If you don't believe me, take out one of those books and put your hand in there and feel." "All right," said Saunders, "but wait till I've rolled up my sleeve. The accumulated dust of centuries, eh?" He took off his coat, knelt down, and thrust his arm along the shelf. "There's something there, right enough," he said. "It's got a funny, stumpy end to it, whatever it is, and nips like a crab. Ah, no you don't." He pulled his hand out in a flash. "Shove in a book quickly. Now it can't get out." "What was it?" asked Eustace. "It was something that wanted very much to get a hold of me. I felt what seemed like a thumb and forefinger. Give me some brandy." "How are we to get it out of there?" "What about a landing net?" "No good. It would be too smart for us. I tell you, Saunders, it can cover the ground far faster than I can walk. But I think I see how we can manage it. The 2 books at the end of the shelf are big ones that go right back against the wall. The others are very thin. I'll take out one at a time, and you slide the rest along until we have it squashed between the end 2. It certainly seemed to be the best plan. One by one, as they took out the books, the space behind grew smaller and smaller. There was something in it that was certainly very much alive. Once they caught sight of fingers pressing outward for a way of escape. At last they had it pressed between the 2 big books. "There's muscle there, if there isn't flesh and blood," said Saunders, as he held them together. "It seems to be a hand right enough, too. I suppose this is a sort of infectious hallucination. I've read about such cases before." "Infectious fiddlesticks," said Eustace, his face white with anger. "Bring the thing downstairs. We'll get it back into the box." It was not altogether easy, but they were successful at last. "Drive in the screws," said Eustace. "We won't run any risks. Put the box in this old desk of mine. There's nothing in it that I want. Here's the key. Thank goodness there's nothing wrong with the lock." "Quite a lively evening," said Saunders. "Now let's hear more about your uncle." They sat up together until early morning. Saunders had no desire for sleep. Eustace was trying to explain and to forget, to conceal from himself a fear that he had never felt before, the fear of walking alone down the long corridor to his bedroom. "Whatever it was," said Eustace to Saunders on the following morning, "I propose that we drop the subject. There's nothing to keep us here for the next 10 days. We'll motor up to the lakes and get some climbing." "And see nobody all day, and sit bored to death with each other every night? Not for me, thanks. Why not run up to town? Run's the exact word in this case, isn't it? We're both in such a blessed funk. Pull yourself together, Eustace, and let's have another look at the hand." "As you like," said Eustace. "There's the key." They went into the library and opened the desk. The box was as they had left it the previous night. "What are you waiting for?" asked Eustace. "I am waiting for you to volunteer to open the lid. However, since you seem to funk it, allow me. There doesn't seem to be any likelihood of any rumpus this morning, at all events." He opened the lid and picked out the hand. "Cold?" asked Eustace. "Tepid. A bit below blood heat by the feel. Soft and supple, too. If it's the embalming, it's a sort of embalming I've never seen before. Is it your uncle's hand?" "Oh, yes, it's his all right," said Eustace. I should know those long, thin fingers anywhere. Put it back in the box, Saunders. Never mind about the screws. I'll lock the desk so that there'll be no chance of its getting out. We'll compromise by motoring up to town for a week. If we get off soon after lunch, we ought to be at Grantham or Stamford by night." "Right," said Saunders. "And tomorrow— oh, well, by tomorrow we shall have forgotten all about this beastly thing." If when the morrow came they had not forgotten, it was certainly true that at the end of the week they were able to tell a very vivid ghost story at the little supper Eustace gave on Halloween. "You don't want us to believe that it's true, Mr. Borlsover. How perfectly awful!" "I'll take my oath on it. And so would Saunders here, wouldn't you, old chap?" "Any number of oaths," said Saunders. "It was a long, thin hand, you know, and it gripped me just like that." "Don't, Mr. Saunders, don't! How perfectly horrid! Now tell us another one, do, only a really creepy one, please." "Here's a pretty mess," said Eustace on the following day as he threw a letter across the table to Saunders. "It's your affair, though. Mrs. Merritt, if I understand it, gives a month's notice." "Oh, that's quite absurd on Mrs. Merritt's part," Saunders replied. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. Let's see what it says." "Dear Sir," he read, "this is to let you know that I must give you a month's notice as from Tuesday the 13th. For a long time I felt the place too big for me, but when Jane Parfitt and Emma Laidlaw go off with scarcely as much as an if you please, after frightening the wits out of the other girls, so they can't turn out a room by themselves, or walk alone down the stairs for fear of treading on half-frozen toads, or hearing it run along the passages at night, all I can say is that it's no place for me. So I must ask you, Mr. Borlsover, sir, to find a new housekeeper that has no objection to large and lonely houses, which some people do say, not that I believe them for a minute, my poor mother always having been a Wesleyan, are haunted. Yours faithfully, Elizabeth Merritt. P.S. I should be obliged if you would give my respects to Mr. Saunders. I hope that he won't run no risks with his cold." "Saunders," said Eustace, "you've always had a wonderful way with you in dealing with servants. You mustn't let poor old Merritt go." "Of course she shan't go," said Saunders. "She's probably only angling for a rise in salary. I'll write to her this morning." "No, there's nothing like a personal interview. We've had enough of town. We'll go back tomorrow, and you must work your cold for all it's worth. Don't forget that it's got onto the chest, and will require weeks of feeding up and nursing." "All right. I think I can manage Mrs. Merritt." But Mrs. Merritt was more obstinate than he had thought. She was very sorry to hear of Mr. Saunders's cold, and how he lay awake all night in London coughing. Very sorry indeed. She'd change his room for him gladly, and get the south room aired. And wouldn't he have a basin of hot bread and milk last thing at night? But she was afraid that she would have to leave at the end of the month. "Try her with an increase of salary," was the advice of Eustace. It was no use. Mrs. Merritt was obdurate, though she knew of a Mrs. Handyside who had been housekeeper to Lord Gargrave, who might be glad to come at the salary mentioned. "What's the matter with servants, Morton?" asked Eustace that evening when he brought the coffee into the library. "What's all this about Mrs. Merritt wanting to leave?" "If you please, sir, I was going to mention it myself. I have a confession to make, sir. When I found your note asking me to open that desk and take out the box with the rat, I broke the lock as you told me, and was glad to do it, because I could hear the animal in the box making a great noise, and I thought it wanted food. So I took out the box, sir, and got a cage, and was going to transfer it, when the animal got away." "What in the world are you talking about? I never wrote any such note." "Excuse me, sir. It was the note I picked up here on the floor on the day you and Mr. Saunders left. I have it in my pocket now." It certainly seemed to be in Eustace's handwriting. It was written in pencil, and began somewhat abruptly. "Get a hammer, Morton," he read, "or some other tool, and break open the lock in the old desk in the library. Take out the box that is inside. You need not do anything else. The lid is already open. Eustace Borlsover." "And you opened the desk?" "Yes, sir, and I was getting the cage ready when the animal hopped out." "What animal?" "The animal inside the box, sir." "What did it look like?" "Well, sir, I couldn't tell you," said Morton nervously. My back was turned, and it was halfway down the room when I looked up. "What was its color?" asked Saunders. "Black?" "Oh, no, sir, a grayish-white. It crept along in a very funny way, sir. I don't think it had a tail." "What did you do then?" "I tried to catch it, but it was no use. So I set the rat traps and kept the library shut. Then that girl Emma Laidlaw left the door open when she was cleaning, and I think it must have escaped." "And you think it was the animal that's been frightening the maids?" "Well, no, sir, not quite. They said it was—you'll excuse me, sir—a hand that they saw. Emma trod on it once at the bottom of the stairs. She thought then it was a half-frozen toad, only white. And then Parfit was washing up the dishes in the scullery. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular. It was close on dusk. She was taking her hands out of the water and was drying them absent-minded-like on the roller towel, when she found that she was drying someone else's hand as well, only colder than hers. "What nonsense!" exclaimed Saunders. "Exactly, sir. That's what I told her, but we couldn't get her to stop." "You don't believe all this," said Eustace, turning suddenly towards the butler. "Me, sir? Oh, no, sir. I've not seen anything." "Nor heard anything?" "Well, sir, if you must know, the bells do ring at odd times, and there's nobody there when we go. And when we go round to draw the blinds of a night, there's often as not somebody's been there before us. But, as I says to Mrs. Merritt, a young monkey might do wonderful things, and we all know that Mr. Borlsover has had some strange animals about the place." "Very well, Morton, that will do." "What do you make of it?" asked Saunders when they were alone. "I mean of the letter he said you wrote." "Oh, that's simple enough," said Eustace. "See the paper it's written on? I stopped using that years ago, but there were a few odd sheets and envelopes left in the old desk. We never fastened up the lid of the box before locking it in. The hand got out, found a pencil, wrote this note, and shoved it through the crack onto the floor where Morton found it. That's plain as daylight." "But the hand couldn't write." "Couldn't it? You've not seen it do the things I've seen." And he told Saunders more of what had happened at Eastbourne. "Well," said Saunders, "in that case we have had at least an explanation of the legacy. It was the hand which wrote unknown to your uncle that letter to your solicitor, bequeathing itself to you. Your uncle had no more to do with that request than I. In fact, it would seem that he had some idea of this automatic writing, and feared it." "Then, if it's not my uncle, what is it?" "I suppose some people might say that a disembodied spirit had got your uncle to educate and prepare a little body for it, and now it's got into that little body and is off on its own." "Well, what are we to do?" "We'll keep our eyes open," said Saunders, "and try to catch it. If we can't do that, we shall have to wait till the bally clockwork runs down. After all, if it's flesh and blood, it can't live forever." For 2 days nothing happened. Then Saunders saw it sliding down the banister in the hall. He was taken unawares, and lost a full second before he started in pursuit, only to find that the thing had escaped him. 3 days later, Eustace, writing alone in the library at night, saw it sitting on an open book at the other end of the room. The fingers crept over the page, feeling the print as if it were reading. But before he had time to get up from the seat, it had taken the alarm and was pulling itself up the curtains. Eustace watched it grimly as it hung onto the cornice with 3 fingers, flicking thumb and forefinger at him in an expression of scornful derision. "I know what I'll do," he said. "If I only get it into the open, I'll set the dogs onto it." He spoke to Saunders of the suggestion. "That's a jolly good idea," he said. "Only we won't wait till we find it out of doors. We'll get the dogs. There are the 2 terriers, and the under-keeper's Irish mongrel that's on to rats like a flash. Your spaniel has not got spirit enough for this sort of game." They brought the dogs into the house, and the keeper's Irish mongrel chewed up the slippers, and the terriers tripped up Morton as he waited at table. But all 3 were welcome. Even false security is better than no security at all. For a fortnight nothing happened. Then the hand was caught, not by the dogs, but by Mrs. Merritt's grey parrot. The bird was in the habit of periodically removing the pins that kept its seed and water tins in place, and of escaping through the holes in the side of the cage. When once at liberty, Peter would show no inclination to return, and would often be about the house for days. Now, after 6 consecutive weeks of captivity, Peter had again discovered a new means of unloosing his bolts and was at large, exploring the tapestried forests of the curtains and singing songs in praise of liberty from cornice and picture rail. "It's no use your trying to catch him," said Eustace to Mrs. Merritt, as she came into the study one afternoon towards dusk with a step-ladder. "You'd much better leave Peter alone. Starve him into surrender, Mrs. Merritt, and don't leave bananas and seed about for him to peck at when he fancies he's hungry. You're far too soft-hearted." "Well, sir, I see he's right out of reach now on that picture rail, so if you wouldn't mind closing the door, sir, when you leave the room, I'll bring his cage in tonight and put some meat inside. He's that fond of meat, though it does make him pull out his feathers to suck the quills. They do say that if you cook—" "Never mind, Mrs. Merritt," said Eustace, who was busy writing. "That will do. I'll keep an eye on the bird." There was silence in the room, unbroken but for the continuous whisper of his pen. "Scratch poor Peter," said the bird. "Scratch poor old Peter." "Be quiet, you beastly bird." "Poor old Peter, scratch poor Peter, do." "I'm more likely to wring your neck if I get hold of you." He looked up at the picture rail, and there was the hand holding on to a hook with 3 fingers, and slowly scratching the head of the parrot with the 4th. Eustace ran to the bell and pressed it hard, then across to the window, which he closed with a bang. Frightened by the noise, the parrot shook its wings preparatory to flight, and as it did so, the fingers of the hand got hold of it by the throat. There was a shrill scream from Peter as he fluttered across the room, wheeling round in circles that ever descended, borne down under the weight that clung to him. The bird dropped at last quite suddenly, and Eustace saw fingers and feathers rolled into an inextricable mass on the floor. The struggle abruptly ceased as finger and thumb squeezed the neck. The bird's eyes rolled up to show the whites, and there was a faint, half-choked gurgle. But before the fingers had time to loose their hold, Eustace had them in his own. "Send Mr. Saunders here at once," he said to the maid, who came in to answer the bell. "Tell him I want him immediately." Then he went with the hand to the fire. There was a ragged gash across the back where the bird's beak had torn it, but no blood oozed from the wound. He noticed with disgust that the nails had grown long and discolored. "I'll burn the beastly thing," he said. But he could not burn it. He tried to throw it into the flames, but his own hands, as if restrained by some old primitive feeling, would not let him. And so Saunders found him, pale and irresolute, with the hand still clasped tightly in his fingers. "I've got it, at last," he said in a tone of triumph. "Good. Let's have a look at it." "Not when it's loose. Get me some nails and a hammer and a board of some sort." "Can you hold it all right?" "Yes, the thing's quite limp. Tired out with throttling poor old Peter, I should say." "And now," said Saunders when he returned with the things, "what are we going to do?" "Drive a nail through it at first so that it can't get away. Then we can take our time over examining it." "Do it yourself," said Saunders. "I don't mind helping you with guinea pigs occasionally when there's something to be learned, partly because I don't fear a guinea pig's revenge. This thing's different." "All right, you miserable skunk. I won't forget the way you've stood by me." He took up a nail, and before Saunders had realized what he was doing, had driven it through the hand, deep into the board. "Oh, my aunt!" he giggled hysterically. "Look at it now!" For the hand was writhing in agonized contortions, squirming and wriggling upon the nail like a worm upon the hook. "Well," said Saunders, "you've done it now. I'll leave you to examine it." "Don't go, in heaven's name! Cover it up, man, cover it up! Shove a cloth over it. Here!" And he pulled off the antimacassar from the back of the chair and wrapped the board in it. "Now, get the keys from my pocket and open the safe. Chuck the other things out. Oh, Lord, it's getting itself into frightful knots. And open it quick." He threw the thing in and banged the door. "We'll keep it there till it dies," he said. "May I burn in hell if I ever open the door of that safe again." Mrs. Merritt departed at the end of the month. Her successor certainly was more successful in the management of the servants. Early in her rule she declared that she would stand no nonsense, and gossip soon withered and died. Eustace Borlsover went back to his old way of life. Old habits crept over and covered his new experience. He was, if anything, less morose, and showed a greater inclination to take his natural part in country society. "I shouldn't be surprised if he marries one of these days," said Saunders. "Well, I'm in no hurry for such an event. I know Eustace far too well for the future Mrs. Borlsover to like me. It will be the same old story again. A long friendship slowly made, marriage, and a long friendship quickly forgotten." But Eustace Borlsover did not follow the advice of his uncle and marry. He was too fond of old slippers and tobacco. The cooking, too, under Mrs. Handyside's management was excellent, and she seemed, too, to have a heaven-sent faculty in knowing when to stop dusting. Little by little the old life resumed its old power. Then came the burglary. The men, it was said, broke into the house by way of the conservatory. It was really little more than an attempt, for they had only succeeded in carrying away a few pieces of plate from the pantry. The safe in the study was certainly found open and empty, but, as Mr. Borlsover informed the police inspector, he had kept nothing of value in it during the last 6 months. "Then you're lucky in getting off so easily, sir," the man replied. "By the way they have gone about their business, I should say they were experienced cracksmen. They must have caught the alarm when they were just beginning their evening's work." "Yes," said Eustace, "I suppose I am lucky." "I have no doubt," said the inspector, "that we shall be able to trace the men. I've said that they must have been old hands at the game. The way they got in and opened the safe shows that. But there's one thing that puzzles me. One of them was careless enough not to wear gloves, and I'm bothered if I know what he was trying to do. I've traced his finger marks on the new varnish on the window sashes in every one of the downstairs rooms. They are very distinct ones, too." "Right hand, or left, or both?" asked Eustace. "Oh, right, every time. That's the funny thing. He must have been a foolhardy fellow, and I rather think it was him that wrote that." He took a slip of paper from his pocket. "That's what he wrote, sir. I've got out, Eustace Borlsover, but I'll be back before long. Some jailbird just escaped, I suppose. It will make it all the easier for us to trace him. Do you know the writing, sir?" "No," said Eustace. "It's not the writing of anyone I know." "I'm not going to stay here any longer," said Eustace to Saunders at luncheon. "I've got on far better during the last 6 months than ever I expected, but I'm not going to run the risk of seeing that thing again. I shall go up to town this afternoon. Get Morton to put my things together and join me in the car at Brighton on the day after tomorrow. And bring the proofs of those 2 papers with you. We'll run over them together." "How long are you going to be away?" "I can't say for certain, but be prepared to stay for some time. We've stuck to work pretty closely through the summer, and I, for one, need a holiday. I'll engage rooms at Brighton. You'll find it best to break the journey at Hitchin. I'll wire to you there at the Crown to tell you the Brighton address." The house he chose at Brighton was in a terrace. He had been there before. It was kept by his old college gyp, a man of discreet silence, who was admirably partnered by an excellent cook. The rooms were on the first floor. The 2 bedrooms were at the back, and opened out of each other. "Saunders can have the smaller one, though it is the only one with a fireplace," he said. "I'll stick to the larger of the 2, since it's got a bathroom adjoining. I wonder what time he'll arrive with the car." Saunders came about 7, cold and cross and dirty. "We'll light the fire in the dining-room," said Eustace, "and get Prince to unpack some of the things while we are at dinner. Oh, what were the roads like?" "Rotten. Swimming with mud, and a beastly cold wind against us all day. And this is July. Dear old England." "Yes," said Eustace, "I think we might do worse than leave dear old England for a few months." They turned in soon after 12. "You oughtn't to feel cold, Saunders," said Eustace, "when you can afford to sport a great catskin-lined coat like this. You do yourself very well, all things considered. Look at those gloves, for instance. Who could possibly feel cold when wearing them? They were far too clumsy, though, for driving. Try them on and see." And he tossed them through the door onto Eustace's bed, and went on unpacking. A minute later he heard a shrill cry of terror. "Oh, Lord!" he heard. "It's in the glove! Quick, Saunders, quick!" Then came a smacking thud. Eustace had thrown it from him. "I've chucked it into the bathroom," he gasped. "It's hit the wall and fallen into the bath. Come now if you want to help." Saunders, with a lighted candle in his hand, looked over the edge of the bath. There it was, old and maimed, dumb and blind, with a ragged hole in the middle, crawling, staggering, trying to creep up the slippery sides, only to fall back helpless. "Stay there," said Saunders. "I'll empty a collar box or something, and we'll jam it in. It can't get out while I'm away." "Yes, it can," shouted Eustace. "It's getting out now. It's climbing up the plug chain. No, you brute, you filthy brute, you don't. Come back, Saunders. It's getting away from me. I can't hold it. It's all slippery. Curse its claw. Shut the window, you idiot. The top, too, as well as the bottom. You utter idiot, it got out." There was the sound of something dropping onto the hard flagstones below, and Eustace fell back, fainting. For a fortnight he was ill. "I don't know what to make of it," the doctor said to Saunders. "I can only suppose that Mr. Borlsover has suffered some great emotional shock. You had better let me send someone to help you nurse him, and by all means indulge that whim of his never to be left alone in the dark. I would keep a light burning all night if I were you. But he must have more fresh air. It's perfectly absurd, this hatred of open windows." Eustace, however, would have no one with him but Saunders. "I don't want the other men," he said. "They'd smuggle it in somehow. I know they would." "Don't worry about it, old chap. This sort of thing can't go on indefinitely. You know I saw it this time as well as you. It wasn't half so active. It won't go on living much longer, especially after that fall. I heard it hit the flags myself. As soon as you're a bit stronger, we'll leave this place. Not bag and baggage, but with only the clothes on our backs, so that it won't be able to hide anywhere. We'll escape it that way. We won't give any address, and we won't have any parcels sent after us. Cheer up, Eustace. You will be well enough to leave in a day or two. The doctor says I can take you out in a chair tomorrow." "What have I done?" asked Eustace. "Why does it come after me? I'm no worse than other men. I'm no worse than you, Saunders. You know I'm not. It was you who were at the bottom of that dirty business in San Diego, and that was 15 years ago." "It's not that, of course," said Saunders. "We are in the 20th century, and even the parsons have dropped the idea of your old sins finding you out. Before you caught the hand in the library, it was filled with pure malevolence, to you and all mankind. After you spiked it through with that nail, it naturally forgot about other people and concentrated its attention on you. It was shut up in the safe, you know, for nearly 6 months. That gives plenty of time for thinking of revenge." Eustace Borlsover would not leave his room, but he thought there might be something in Saunders' suggestion to leave Brighton without notice. He began rapidly to regain his strength. "We'll go on the 1st of September," he said. The evening of August 31st was oppressively warm. Though at midday the windows had been wide open, they had been shut an hour or so before dusk. Mrs. Prince had long since ceased to wonder at the strange habits of the gentlemen on the first floor. Soon after their arrival she had been told to take down the heavy window curtains in the 2 bedrooms, and day by day the rooms had seemed to grow more bare. Nothing was left lying about. "Mr. Borlsover doesn't like to have any place where dirt can collect," Saunders had said as an excuse. "He likes to see into all the corners of the room." "Couldn't I open the window just a little?" he said to Eustace that evening. "We're simply roasting in here, you know." "No, leave well alone. We're not a couple of boarding-school misses fresh from a course of hygiene lectures. Get the chessboard out." They sat down and played. At 10 o'clock Mrs. Prince came to the door with a note. "I am sorry I didn't bring it before," she said, "but it was left in the letter box." "Open it, Saunders, and see if it wants answering." It was very brief. There was neither address nor signature. "Will 11 o'clock tonight be suitable for our last appointment?" "Who is it from?" asked Borlsover. "It was meant for me," said Saunders. "There's no answer, Mrs. Prince," and he put the paper into his pocket. "A dunning letter from a tailor. I suppose he must have got wind of our leaving." It was a clever lie, and Eustace asked no more questions. They went on with their game. On the landing outside, Saunders could hear the grandfather's clock whispering the seconds, blurting out the quarter hours. "Check," said Eustace. The clock struck 11. At the same time there was a gentle knocking on the door. It seemed to come from the bottom panel. "Who's there?" asked Eustace. There was no answer. "Mrs. Prince, is that you?" "She's up above," said Saunders. "I can hear her walking about the room." "Then lock the door. Bolt it too. Your move, Saunders." While Saunders sat with his eyes on the chessboard, Eustace walked over to the window and examined the fastenings. He did the same in Saunders's room and the bathroom. There were no doors between the 3 rooms, or he would have shut and locked them too. "Now, Saunders," he said, "don't stay all night over your move. I've had time to smoke 1 cigarette already. It's bad to keep an invalid waiting. There's only one possible thing for you to do." "What was that?" "The ivy blowing against the window. There, it's your move now, Eustace." "It wasn't the ivy, you idiot. It was someone tapping at the window." And he pulled up the blind. On the outer side of the window, clinging to the sash, was the hand. "What is that it's holding?" "It's a pocket-knife. It's going to try to open the window by pushing back the fastener with the blade." "Well, let it try," said Eustace. "Those fasteners screw down. They can't be opened that way. Anyhow, we'll close the shutters. It's your move, Saunders. I've played." But Saunders found it impossible to fix his attention on the game. He could not understand Eustace, who seemed all at once to have lost his fear. "What do you say to some wine?" he asked. "You seem to be taking things coolly, but I don't mind confessing that I'm in a blessed funk." "You've no need to be. There's nothing supernatural about that hand, Saunders. I mean, it seems to be governed by the laws of time and space. It's not the sort of thing that vanishes into thin air or slides through oaken doors. And since that's so, I defy it to get in here. We'll leave the place in the morning. I, for one, have bottomed the depths of fear. Fill your glass, man. The windows are all shuttered, the door is locked and bolted. Pledge me my Uncle Adrian. Drink, man. What are you waiting for?" Saunders was standing with his glass half raised. "It can get in," he said hoarsely. "It can get in. We've forgotten. There's the fireplace in my bedroom. It will come down the chimney." "Quick," said Eustace as he rushed into the other room. "We haven't a minute to lose. What can we do? Light the fire, Saunders. Give me a match, quick." "They must be all in the other room. I'll get them." "Hurry, man, for goodness' sake. Look in the bookcase. Look in the bathroom. Here, come and stand here. I'll look." "Be quick," shouted Saunders. "I can hear something." "Then plug a sheet from your bed up the chimney. No, here's a match." He found one at last that had slipped into a crack in the floor. "Is the fire laid? Good. But it may not burn. I know. The oil from that old reading lamp and this cotton wool. Now the match, quick. Pull the sheet away, you fool. We don't want it now." There was a great roar from the grate as the flame shot up. Saunders had been a fraction of a second too late with the sheet. The oil had fallen onto it. It, too, was burning. "The whole place will be on fire!" cried Eustace as he tried to beat out the flames with a blanket. "It's no good. I can't manage it. You must open the door, Saunders, and get help." Saunders ran to the door and fumbled with the bolts. The key was stiff in the lock. "Hurry!" shouted Eustace. The whole place is ablaze!" The key turned in the lock at last. For half a second Saunders stopped to look back. Afterwards he could never be quite sure as to what he had seen, but at the time he thought that something black and charred was creeping slowly, very slowly from the mass of flames towards Eustace Borlsover. For a moment he thought of returning to his friend, but the noise and the smell of the burning sent him running down the passage, crying, "Fire! Fire!" He rushed to the telephone to summon help, and then back to the bathroom — he should have thought of that before — for water. As he burst open the bedroom door there came a scream of terror which ended suddenly, and then the sound of a heavy fall. This is the story which I heard on successive Saturday evenings from the senior mathematical master at a second-rate suburban school. For Saunders has had to earn a living in a way which other men might reckon less congenial than his old manner of life. I had mentioned by chance the name of Adrian Borlsover, and wondered at the time why he changed the conversation with such unusual abruptness. A week later Saunders began to tell me something of his own story, sordid enough, though shielded with reserve I could well understand, for it had to cover not only his failings, but those of a dead friend. Of the final tragedy he was at first especially loath to speak, and it was only gradually that I was able to piece together the narrative of the preceding pages. Saunders was reluctant to draw any conclusions. At one time he thought that the fingered beast had been animated by the spirit of Sigismund Borlsover, a sinister 18th-century ancestor, who, according to legend, built and worshipped in the ugly pagan temple that overlooked the lake. At another time Saunders believed the spirit belonged to a man whom Eustace had once employed as a laboratory assistant. A black-haired, spiteful little brute, he said, who died cursing his doctor because the fellow couldn't help him to live to settle some paltry score with Borlsover. From the point of view of direct contemporary evidence, Saunders's story is practically uncorroborated. All the letters mentioned in the narrative were destroyed, with the exception of the last note which Eustace received, or rather which he would have received had not Saunders intercepted it. That I have seen myself. The handwriting was thin and shaky, the handwriting of an old man. I remember the Greek E was used in appointment. A little thing that amused me at the time was that Saunders seemed to keep the note pressed between the pages of his Bible. I had seen Adrian Borlsover once. Saunders I learnt to know well. It was by chance, however, and not by design, that I met a third person of the story, Morton the butler. Saunders and I were walking in the Zoological Gardens one Sunday afternoon, when he called my attention to an old man who was standing before the door of the reptile house. "Why, Morton," he said, clapping him on the back, "how is the world treating you?" "Poorly, Mr. Saunders," said the old fellow, though his face lighted up at the greeting. "The winters drag terribly nowadays. They don't seem no summers or springs." "You haven't found what you're looking for, I suppose?" "No, sir, not yet, but I shall do some day. I always told them that Mr. Borlsover kept some queer animals." "And what is he looking for?" I asked when we parted from him. "A beast with 5 fingers," said Saunders. "This afternoon, since he has been in the reptile house, I suppose it will be a reptile with a hand. Next week it will be a monkey with practically no body. The poor old chap is a born materialist." "It's a queer coincidence, by the way, that you should have known Adrian Borlsover, and that you should have received a blessing at his hand. Has it brought you any luck?" "No," I answered slowly, as I looked back over a life of inconspicuous failure. "I don't think it has. It was his right hand, you know." End of The Beast with 5 Fingers by William F. Harvey. This recording is in the public domain.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captain Murderer, an excerpt from The Uncommercial Traveller, Chapter 15, Nurse's Tales, by Charles Dickens. Read for LibriVox by Beth Peat at Reading, UK. The first diabolical character who intruded himself on my peaceful youth, as I called to mind that day at Dullborough, was a certain Captain Murderer. This wretch must have been an offshoot of the Bluebeard family, but I had no suspicion of the consanguinity in those times. His warning name would seem to have awakened no general prejudice against him, for he was admitted into the best society and possessed immense wealth. Captain Murderer's mission was matrimony, and the gratification of a cannibal appetite with tender brides. On his marriage morning he always caused both sides of the way to the church to be planted with curious flowers, and when his bride said, "Dear Captain Murderer, I never saw flowers like these before. What are they called?" he answered, "They are called garnish for house lamb," and laughed at his ferocious practical joke in a horrid manner, disquieting the minds of the noble bridal company with a very sharp row of teeth then displayed for the first time. He made love in a coach and six, and married in a coach and 12, and all his horses were milk-white horses with one red spot on the back which he caused to be hidden by the harness. For the spot would come there, though every horse was milk-white when Captain Murderer bought him, and the spot was young bride's blood. To this terrific point I am indebted for my personal experience of a shudder and cold beads in the forehead. When Captain Murderer had made an end of feasting and revelry, and had dismissed the noble guests, and was alone with his wife on the day of the month after their marriage, it was his whimsical custom to produce a golden rolling pin and a silver pie-board. Now there was a special feature in the captain's courtships that he always asked if the young lady could make pie crust, and if she couldn't by nature or education, she was taught. Well, when the bride saw Captain Murderer produce the golden rolling pin and silver pie-board, she remembered this, and turned up her laced silk sleeves to make a pie. The captain brought out a silver pie dish of immense capacity, and the captain brought out flour and butter and eggs and all things needful, except the inside of the pie. Of the materials for the staple of the pie itself, the captain brought out none. Then said the lovely bride, "Dear Captain Murderer, what pie is this to be?" He replied, "A meat pie." Then said the lovely bride, "Dear Captain Murderer, I see no meat." The captain humorously retorted, "Look in the glass." She looked in the glass, but still she saw no meat, and then the captain roared with laughter, and suddenly frowning and drawing his sword, bade her roll out the crust. So she rolled out the crust, dropping large tears upon it all the time because he was so cross, and when she had lined the dish with the crust, and had cut the crust all ready to fit the top, the captain called out, "I see meat in the glass," and the bride looked up at the glass, just in time to see the captain cutting her head off, and he chopped her in pieces, and peppered her, and salted her, and put her in the pie, and sent it to the baker's, and ate it all, and picked the bones. Captain Murderer went on in this way, prospering exceedingly, until he came to choose a bride from two twin sisters, and at first didn't know which to choose. For though the one was fair and the other dark, they were both equally beautiful. But the fair twin loved him, and the dark twin hated him, so he chose the fair one. The dark twin would have prevented the marriage if she could, but she couldn't. However, on the night before it, much suspecting Captain Murderer, she stole out and climbed his garden wall, and looked in at his window through a chink in the shutter, and saw him having his teeth filed sharp. Next day she listened all day, and heard him make his joke about the house lamb. And that day month he had the paste rolled out, cut the fair twin's head off, and chopped her in pieces, and peppered her, and salted her, and put her in the pie, and sent it to the baker's, and ate it all, and picked the bones. Now the dark twin had had her suspicions much increased by the filing of the captain's teeth, and again by the house lamb joke. Putting all things together when he gave out that her sister was dead, she divined the truth, and determined to be revenged. So she went up to Captain Murderer's house, and knocked at the knocker, and pulled at the bell, and when the captain came to the door, said, "Dear Captain Murderer, marry me next, for I have always loved you and was jealous of my sister." The captain took it as a compliment, and made a polite answer, and the marriage was quickly arranged. On the night before it, the bride again climbed to his window, and again saw him having his teeth filed sharp. At this sight she laughed such a terrible laugh at the chink in the shutter that the captain's blood curdled, and he said, "I hope nothing has disagreed with me." At that she laughed again, a still more terrible laugh, and the shutter was opened and a search made, but she was nimbly gone, and there was no one. Next day they went to church in a coach and 12, and were married. And that day month she rolled the pie crust out, and Captain Murderer cut her head off, and chopped her in pieces, and peppered her, and salted her, and put her in a pie, and sent it to the baker's, ate it all, and picked the bones. But before she began to roll out the paste, she had taken a deadly poison of the most awful character, distilled from toads' eyes and spiders' knees, and Captain Murderer had hardly picked her last bone, when he began to swell, and to turn blue, and to be all over spots, and to scream. And he went on swelling and turning bluer, and being more all over spots and screaming, until he reached from floor to ceiling, and from wall to wall, and then, at 1 o'clock in the morning, he blew up with a loud explosion. At the sound of it, the milk-white horses in the stables broke their halters and went mad, and then they galloped over everybody in Captain Murderer's house, beginning with the family blacksmith who had filed his teeth, until the whole were dead, and then they galloped away. End of Captain Murderer by Charles Dickens.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recorded by me, Glenn Hallstrom, also known as Smokestack Jones. smokestackjones@gmail.com. You'll also find my blog at toomuchjohnson.blogspot.com. The Doom That Came to Sarnath by H.P. Lovecraft. There is in the land of Minar a vast still lake that is fed by no stream, and out of which no stream flows. 10,000 years ago there stood by its shore the mighty city of Sarnath, but Sarnath stands there no more. It is told that in the immemorial years when the world was young, before ever the men of Sarnath came to the land of Minar, another city stood beside the lake, the grey stone city of Ib, which was old as the lake itself, and peopled with beings not pleasing to behold. Very odd and ugly were these beings, as indeed are most beings of a world yet inchoate and rudely fashioned. It is written on the brick cylinders of Kadatheron that the beings of Ib were in hue as green as the lake and the mists that rise above it. They had bulging eyes, pouting, flabby lips, and curious ears, and were without voice. It is also written that they descended one night from the moon in a mist, they and the vast still lake and grey stone city Ib. However this may be, it is certain that they worshipped a sea-green stone idol, chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the great water lizard, before which they danced horribly when the moon was gibbous. And it is written in the papyrus of Ilarnek that they one day discovered fire, and thereafter kindled flames on many ceremonial occasions. But not much is written of these beings, because they lived in very ancient times, and man is young and knows little of the very ancient living things. After many eons men came to the land of Minar, dark shepherd folk, with their fleecy flocks, who built Thra, Ilarnek, and Kadatheron on the winding river Ai. And certain tribes, more hardy than the rest, pushed to the border of the lake and built Sarnath, at a point where precious metals were found in the earth. Not far from the great city of Ib did the wandering tribes lay the first stones of Sarnath, and at the beings of Ib they marveled greatly. But with their marveling was mixed hate, for they thought it not meet that beings of such aspect should walk about the world of men at dusk. Nor did they like the strange sculptures upon the grey monoliths of Ib, for why these sculptures lingered so late in the world, even until the coming of men, none can tell, unless it was because the land of Minar is very still, and remote from most other lands, both of waking and of dream. As the men of Sarnath beheld more of the beings of Ib, their hate grew, and it was not less because they found the beings weak, and soft as jelly to the touch of stones and arrows. So one day the young warriors, the slingers, and the spearmen, and the bowmen marched against Ib and slew all inhabitants thereof, pushing the queer bodies into the lake with long spears, because they did not wish to touch them, and because they did not like the grey sculptured monoliths of Ib. They cast these also into the lake, wondering from the greatness of the labor, however the stones were brought from afar, as they must have been, since there is not like them in the land of Manar, or in the lands adjacent. Thus of the very ancient city of Ib was nothing spared, save the sea-green stone idol chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug the water lizard. This the young warriors took back with them as a symbol of conquest over the old gods and beings of the, and as the sign of leadership in Manar. But on the night after it was set up in the temple, a terrible thing must have happened, for weird lights were seen over the lake, and in the morning the people found the idol gone, and the high priest Tarnish lying dead, as from some fear unspeakable. And before he died, Tarnish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite, with coarse shaky strokes, the sign of doom. After Tarnish there were many high priests in Sarnath, but never was the sea-green stone idol found, and many centuries came and went, wherein Sarnath prospered exceedingly, so that only priests and old women remembered what Tarnish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite. Betwixt Sarnath and the city of Alarnec arose a caravan route, and the precious metals from the earth were exchanged for other metals, and rare cloths, and jewels, and books, and tools for artificers, and all things of luxury that are known to people who dwell along the winding river Ai and beyond. So Sarnath waxed mighty and learned and beautiful, and set forth conquering armies to subdue the neighboring cities, and in time there sate upon the throne in Sarnath the kings of all the land of Manar and of many lands adjacent. The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the magnificent. Of polished desert quarried marble were its walls, in height 300 cubits, and in breadth 75, so that chariots might pass each other as men drove them along the top. For full 500 stadia they did run, being open not only on the side towards the lake, where a sea-green stone wall kept back the waves that rose oddly once a year at the festival of the destroying of Ib. In Sarnath were 50 streets from the lake to the gates of the caravans, and 50 more intersecting them. With onyx they were paved, save those whereon the horses and camels and elephants trod, which were paved with granite. And the gates of Sarnath were as many as the landward ends of the streets, each of bronze, and flanked by the figures of lions and elephants, carven from some stone no longer among men. The houses of Sarnath were glazed brick and chalcedony, each having its walled garden and crystal lakelet. With strange art they were builded, for no other city had houses like them, and travelers from Thra and Alarnec and Cathadaron marveled at the shining domes whereon they were surmounted. But more marvelous still were the palaces and the temples and the gardens made by Zakar the olden king. There were many palaces, the last of which were mightier than any in Thra or Alarnec or Cathadaron. So high were they that one within might sometimes fancy himself beneath only the sky. Yet when lighted with torches dipped in the oil of Dother, their walls showed vast paintings of kings and armies, of a splendor at once inspiring and stupefying to the beholder. Many were the pillars of the palaces, all of tinted marble, and carven into designs of surpassing beauty. And in most of the palaces the floors were mosaics of beryl and lapis lazuli and sardonyx and carbuncle, and other choice materials, so disposed that the beholder might fancy himself walking over beds of the rarest flowers. And there were likewise fountains which cast scented waters about in pleasing jets, arranged with cunning art. Outshining all others was the palace of the kings of Manar and of the lands adjacent. On a pair of golden crouching lions rested the throne, many steps above the gleaming floor, and it was wrought of one piece of ivory, though no man lives who knows whence so vast a piece could have come. In that palace there were so many galleries, and many amphitheaters where lions and men and elephants battled at the pleasure of the kings. Sometimes the amphitheaters were flooded with water conveyed from the lake in mighty aqueducts, and then were enacted stirring sea fights or combats betwixt swimmers and deadly marine beings. Lofty and amazing were the 17 tower-like temples of Sarnath, fashioned of a bright multicolored stone not known elsewhere. A full 1,000 cubits high stood the greatest among them, wherein the high priest dwelt with a magnificence scarce less than that of the kings. On the ground were halls as vast and splendid as those of the palaces, where gathered throngs in worship of Zokalar and Tamash and Laban, the chief gods of Sarnath, whose incense-enveloped shrines were as the thrones of monarchs. Not like the Echians of other gods were those of Zokalar and Tamash and Laban, for so close to life were they that one might swear the graceful bearded gods themselves sate on the ivory thrones. And up unending steps of zircon was the tower chamber, where from the high priest looked out over the city and the plains and the lake by day, and at the cryptic moon and significant stars and planets, and the reflections in the lake at night. Here was done the very secret and ancient rite in detestation of Bakrog the water lizard, and here rested the altar of chrysolite, which bore the doom scroll of Taranish. Wonderful likewise were the gardens made by Zakar, the olden king. In the center of Sarnath they lay, covering a great space and encircled by a high wall, and they were surmounted by a mighty dome of glass, through which shone the sun and moon and planets when it was clear, and from which hung fulgent images of the sun and the moon and stars and planets when it was not clear. In summer the gardens were cooled with fresh odorous breezes skillfully wafted by fans, and in winter they were heated with concealed fires, so that in those gardens it was always spring. There ran little streams over bright pebbles, dividing meads of green and gardens of many hues, and spanned by a multitude of bridges. Many were the waterfalls in their courses, and many were the hued lakelets into which they expanded. Over the streams and lakelets rode white swans, whilst the music of rare birds chimed in with the melody of the waters. In ordered terraces rose the green banks, adorned here and there with bowers of vines and sweet blossoms, and seats and benches of marble and porphyry, and there were many small shrines and temples where one might rest or pray to small gods. Each year there was celebrated in Sarnath the feast of the destroying of Ib, at which time wine, song, dancing, and merriment of every kind abounded. Great honors were then paid to the shades of those who had annihilated the odd ancient beings, and the memory of those beings and their elder gods was derided by dancers and lutanists, crowned with roses from the gardens of Zakar, and the kings would look out over the lake and curse the bones of the dead that lay beneath it. At first the high priest liked not these festivals, for there had descended amongst them queer tales of how the sea-green Echion had vanished, and how Taranish had died from fear and left a warning, and they said that from their high tower they sometimes saw lights beneath the waters of the lake. But as many years passed without calamity, even the priests laughed and cursed and joined in the orgies of the feasters. Indeed, had they not themselves in the high tower often performed the very ancient and secret rite in detestation of Bakrog the water lizard? And 1,000 years of riches and delight passed over Sarnath, wonder of the world. Gorgeous beyond thought was the feast of the 1,000th year of the destroying of Ib. For a decade it had been talked about in the land of Manar, and as it drew nigh there came to Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants men from Thra, Alarnec, and Cathaderon, and all the cities of Manar and the lands beyond. Before the marble walls on the appointed night were pitched the pavilions of princes and the tents of travelers. Within his banquet hall reclined Nargis Hay the king, drunken with ancient wine from the vaults of conquered Panath, and surrounded by feasting nobles and hurrying slaves. There were eaten many strange delicacies at their feast: peacocks from the distant hills of Linpan, heels of camels from the Basnic desert, nuts and spices from the Cedarian groves, and pearls from wave-washed metal, dissolved in the vinegar of Thra. Of sauces there were an untold number, prepared by the subtlest cooks in all Manar, and suited to the palate of every feaster. But most prized of all the viands were the great fishes from the lake, each of vast size, and served upon golden platters set with rubies and diamonds. Whilst the king and his nobles feasted within the palace and viewed the crowning dish as it awaited them on golden platters, others feasted elsewhere. In the tower of the great temple the priests held revels, and in pavilions without the walls the princes of neighboring lands made merry. And it was the high priest Naika who first saw the shadows that descended from the gibbous moon into the lake, and the damnable green mist that rose from the lake to meet the moon and to shroud in a sinister haze the towers of the domes of fetid Sarnath. Thereafter those in the towers and without the walls beheld strange lights on the water, and saw that the grey rock Akurian, which was wont to rear high above it near the shore, was almost submerged. And fear grew vaguely yet swiftly, so that the princes of Ilarnak and of Far Rakol took down and folded their tents and pavilions and departed, though they scarce knew the reason for their departing. Then, close to the hour of midnight, all the bronze gates of Sarnath burst open, and emptied forth a frenzied throng that blackened the plain, so that all the visiting princes and travelers fled away in fright, for on the faces of this throng was writ a madness born of horror unendurable, and on the tongues were words so terrible that no hearer paused for proof. Men whose eyes were wild with fear shrieked aloud at the sight within the king's banquet hall, where through the windows were seen no longer the forms of Nargishai and his nobles and slaves, but a horde of indescribable green, voiceless things with bulging eyes, pouting, flabby lips, and curious ears, things which danced horribly, bearing in their paws golden platters set with rubies and diamonds, and containing uncouth flames. And the princes and travelers, as they fled from the doomed city of Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants, looked again upon the mist-begetting lake, and saw the great rock Akurian was quite submerged. Through all the land of Manar and the land adjacent spread the tales of those who had fled from Sarnath, and caravans sought that accursed city and its precious metals no more. It was long ere any travelers went thither, and even then only the brave and adventurous young men of yellow hair and blue eyes who were no kin to the men of Manar. These men indeed went to the lake to view Sarnath, but though they found the vast still lake itself and the grey rock Akurian which rears high above it near the shore, they beheld not the wonder of the world and pride of all mankind. Where once had risen walls of 300 cubits and towers yet higher, now stretched only the marshy shore, and where once had dwelt 50 million of men, now crawled the detestable water lizard. Not even the mines of precious metal remained. Doom had come to Sarnath. But half buried in the rushes was spied a curious green idol, an exceedingly ancient idol chiseled in the likeness of Bakrog, the great water lizard. That idol, enshrined in the high temple at Ilarnak, was subsequently worshipped beneath the gibbous moon throughout the land of Manar. The End of The Doom That Came to Sarnath by H.P. Lovecraft.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Yearsley. A Dreadful Night by Edwin Lester Arnold. Only he who has been haunted by a dream, a black horror of the night, so real and terrible that many days of repugnance and effort are needed to purge the mind of its ugly details, can understand how a dream that was a fact, a horrible waking fantasy, grotesque and weird, a repetition in hard actuality of the ingenious terrors of sleep, clings to him who, with his faculties about him and all his senses on the alert, has experienced it. Some 5 years ago I was hunting in the southwest corner of Colorado, where the great mountain spurs slope down in rocky ravines and gullies from the inland ranges towards the green plains along the course of the Rio San Juan. I had left my camp late one afternoon in charge of my trusty comrade, Will Hartland, and had wandered off alone into the scrub. Some 5 or 6 miles from the tents I stalked and wounded a buck. He was so hard hit that I already smelt venison in the supper pot, and followed the broad trail he had left with the utmost eagerness. He crossed a couple of stony ridges with their deep intervening hollows, and came at last into a wild, desolate gorge, full of loose rocks and bushes, and ribboned with game tracks, but otherwise a most desolate and God-forsaken place, where no man had been, or might come, for 50 years. Here I sighted my venison staggering down the glen, and dashed after him as fast as I could, through the bushy tangles and the dry, slippery summer grass. In a few 100 yards the valley became a pass, and in a score more the steep bare sides had drawn in until they were walls on either hand, and the way trailed along the bottom of what was little better than a knife cleft in the hills. I was a good runner, and the hunter blood was hot within me. My moccasins flashed through the yellow herbage, my cheeks burnt with excitement. I dropped my gun to be the freer. The quarry was plunging along only 10 yards ahead, and seemed a certain victim. In front was the outing of that narrow ravine, long reaches of the silver San Juan twining in countless threads through interminable leagues of green pasture and forest. I saw it all like a beautiful picture in the narrow black frame of the rocks. The evening wind was blowing softly up the canyon, and the sky was already gorgeous and livid with the streaks of sunset. Another 10 yards, and we were flying down the narrowest part of the defile, the beast path under our feet hardly a foot wide, and almost hidden by long, wiry, dead grass. Suddenly the wounded buck, now within my grasp, staggered up onto its hind legs in a mad fit of terror, just as, with a shout of triumph, I leapt up to it, and in half a breathing space I and the stag were reeling on the very brink of a horrible funnel, a slippery yellow slope that had opened suddenly before us, leading down to a cavernous mouth, gaping, dark and dreadful in the heart of the earth. With a scream louder than my shout of triumph, I threw up my hands and tried to stop. It was too late. I felt my feet slip from under me, and in a second, shouting and plunging and clutching at the rotten herbage, I was flying downwards. I caught a last glimpse of the San Juan and the blaze of sky overhead, and then I was spinning into darkness, horrible Stygian darkness, through which I fell for a giddy, senseless moment or two, and then landed with a thud which ought to have killed me, bruised and nearly senseless, on a soft, quaggy mound of something that seemed to sink under me like a feather bed. I passed out. My first sensation on recovering consciousness was that of an overpowering smell, a sickly, deadly taint in the air that there was no growing accustomed to, and which, after a few gasps, seemed to have run its deadly venom into every corner of my frame, and, turning my blood yellow, to have transformed my constitution into keeping with its own accursed nature. It was a damp, musty, charnel house smell, sickly and wicked, with the breath of the slaughter pit in it, an aroma of blood and corruption. I sat up and glared, gasped about in the gloom, and then I carefully felt my limbs up and down. All was safe and sound, and I was unhurt, though as sore and bruised as if my body had stood a long day's pummelling. Then I groped about me in the pitch dark, and soon touched the still, warm body of the dead buck I had shot, and on which, indeed, I was sitting. Still feeling about, I found on the other side something soft and furry too. I touched and patted it, and in a minute recognized with a start that my fingers were deep in the curly mane of a bull bison. I pulled, and the curly mane came off in stinking tufts. That bull bison had been lying there 6 months or more. All about me, wherever I felt, was cold, clammy fur and hair and hoofs and bare ribs and bones mixed in wild confusion, and as that wilderness of death unfolded itself in the darkness to me, and the fetid, close atmosphere mounted to my head, my nerves began to tremble like harp strings in a storm, and my heart, that I had always thought terror-proof, to patter like a girl's. Plunging and slipping, I got upon my feet, and then became conscious of a dim circle of twilight far above, representing the hole through which I had fallen. The twilight was fading outside every moment, and it was already so faintly luminous that my hand, held in front of me, looked ghostly and scarcely discernible. I began to explore slowly round the walls of my prison. With a heart that grew sicker and sicker, and sensations that you can imagine better than I can describe, I traced the jagged but unbroken circle of a great chamber in the underground, 100 feet long perhaps, by 50 across, with cruel, remorseless walls that rose sloping gently inward from an uneven, horrible floor of hides and bones to that narrow neck far overhead, where the stars were already twinkling in a cloudless sky. By this time I was fairly frightened, and the cold perspiration of dread began to stand in beads upon my forehead. A fancy then seized me that someone might be within hearing distance above. I shouted again and again, and listening acutely each time as the echoes of my shout died away, I could have sworn something like the clash of ghostly teeth on teeth, something like the rattle of jaws in an ague fit, fell on the silence behind. With beating heart and an unfamiliar dread creeping over me, I crouched down in the gloom and listened. There was water dripping out in the dark, monotonous and dismal, and something like the breath from a husky throat, away in the distance of the cavern, came fitfully to my ears, though so uncertain that at first I thought it might have been only the rustle of the wind in the grass far overhead. Again, mastering all my resolution, I shouted until the darkness rang, then listened eagerly with every faculty on stretch, and again from the dimness came that tremulous gnashing of teeth and that wavering, long-drawn breath. Then my hair literally stood on end, and my eyes were fixed with breathless wonder in front of me, for out of the remotest gloom, where the corruption of the floor was already beginning to glow with pale blue wavering phosphorescent light as the night fell, rose, glimmering itself with that ghastly lustre, something slim and tall and tremulous. It was full of life, and yet was not quite of human form, and reared itself against the dark wall, all agleam, until its top, set with hollow eyes, was 9 or 10 feet from the ground, and oscillated and wavered, and seemed to feel about, as I had done, for an opening, and then, on a sudden, collapsed in a writhing heap upon the ground, and I distinctly heard the fall of its heavy body as it disappeared into the blue inferno that burnt below. Again that spectral thing rose laboriously, this time many paces nearer to me, to twice the height of a man, and wavered and felt about, and then sank down with a fall like the fall of heavy draperies, as though the energy that had lifted it suddenly expired. Nearer and nearer it came, travelling round the circuit of the walls in that strange way, and, awed and bewildered, I crept out into the open to let that dreadful thing go by. And presently, to my infinite relief, it travelled away, still wavering and writhing, and I breathed again. As that luminous shadow faded into the remote corners of the cave, I shouted once more, for the pleasure, it must have been, of hearing my own voice. Again there was that gnashing of teeth, and the instant afterwards such a hideous chorus of yells from the other side of the cavern, such a commingled howl of lost spirits, such an infernal moan of sorrow and shame and misery that rose and fell on the stillness of the night, that for an instant, lost to everything but that dreadful sound, I leapt to my feet with the stagnant blood cold as ice within me, my body pulseless for the moment, and mingled my mad shouting with the voices of those unseen devils in a hideous chorus. Then my manhood came back with a rush upon me, and judgment and sense, and I recognized in the trembling echoes a cry that I had often listened to in happier circumstances. That uproar came from the throats of wolves that had been trapped like myself. But were they alive? I thought, in fascinated wonder, how could they be in this horrible pit? And if they were not, picture oneself cornered in such a trap with a pack of wolfish spirits. It would not bear thinking of. Already my fancy saw constellations of fierce yellow eyes everywhere, and herds of wicked grey backs racing to and fro in the shadows. With a tremulous hand I felt in my pocket for a match, and found I had two, and two only. By this time the moon was up, and a great band of silver light, broad and bright, was creeping down the walls of our prison. But I would not wait for it. I struck the match with feverish eagerness, and held it overhead. It burnt brightly for a moment, and I saw I was in a great natural crypt, with no outlet anywhere but by the narrow neck above, and all chance of reaching that was impossible, as the walls sloped inwards everywhere as they rose to it. All the floor was piled thigh-deep with a ghastly tangle of animal remains, in every state of return to their native earth, from the bare bones that would have crumbled at a touch, to the hide, still glossy and sleek, of the stag that had fallen in only a week or two before. Such a carnage place I never saw. Such furs, such trophies, such heads and horns there were all round, as raised the envy of my hunter spirit even in that emergency. But what held me spellbound and rooted my eyes into the shadows was, 20 paces off, lying full stretch along the glossy undulating path which the incessant feet of new victims had worn, month after month, over the hill and valley of dead bodies under the walls, a splendid 18-foot python. It was this creature's ghostly rambles and ineffectual attempts to scale the walls that had first scared me in that place of horrors. I turned round, for the match was short, and scarcely noticing a score or two of dejected rats, who squeaked and scrambled amongst lesser snakes and strange reptiles, looked hard across the cave. There, on their haunches, in a huddle against the far wall, staring at me with dull, cold eyes, were 5 of the biggest, ugliest wolves ever mortal saw. I had often seen wolves, but never any like those. All the pluck, grace, and savage vigour of their kind had gone from them. Their bodies, gorged with carrion, were vast, swollen, and hideous. Their shaggy fur was hanging in tatters from their red and mangy skins. The saliva streamed from their jaws in yellow ribbons. Their bleary eyes were drowsy and dull. Their great throats, as they opened them to howl in sad chorus at the handful of purple night above, were dry and yellow, and there was about them such an air of disgusting misery and woe-begonness, that with a shudder and a cry I could not suppress, I let the last embers of the burning match fall to the ground. How long I crouched in the darkness against the wall, with those hideous serenaders grinding their foam-flecked teeth and bemoaning our common fate in hideous unison, I do not know, nor have I space to tell the wild, horrible visions which filled my mind for the next hour or two. But presently the moonlight had come down off the wall, and was spread at my feet in a silver carpet, and as I sullenly watched the completion of that arena of light, I was aware that the wolves were moving. Very slowly they came forward out of the darkness, led by the biggest and ugliest, until they were all in the silver circle, gaunt, spectral, and vile, every mangy tuft of loose hair upon their sore speckled backs clear as daylight. Then those pot-bellied, phosphorescent undertakers began the strangest movements, and after watching them for a moment or two in fascinated wonder, I saw they had come to me, in their despair, to solicit my companionship and countenance. I could not have believed it possible that dumb brutes could have made their meaning so clear as those poor shaggy scoundrels did. They halted 10 yards off, and with humble heads sagged down, and averted eyes, slowly wagged their mud-locked tails. Then they came a few steps further, and whined and fawned, and then another pace, and lay down upon their stomachs, putting their noses between their paws like dogs who watch and doze, while they regarded me steadfastly with sad great eyes, forlorn and terrible. Foot by foot, grey and silver in the moonlight, they advanced with the offer of their dreadful friendship, until at last I was fairly bewitched, and when the big wolf came forward till he was at my knees, a horrible epitome of corruption, and licked my hand with his great burning tongue, I submitted to the caress as readily as though he were my favourite hound. Henceforth the pack seemed to think the compact was sealed, and thrust their odious company upon me, trotting at my heels, howling when I shouted, and muzzling down to me, putting their heavy paws upon my feet, and their great steaming jaws upon my chest, whenever, in despair and weariness, I tried to snatch a moment's sleep. But it would be impossible to go step by step through the infinitely painful hours of that night. Not only was the place full of spectral forms and strange cries, but presently legions of unclean things of 100 kinds that had lived on those dead beasts when they too were living, swarmed in thousands and assailed us, adding a new terror to the inferno, ravaging us who still kept body and soul together, till our flesh seemed burning on our bones. There was no rest for man or brute. The light was a mockery, and the silence hideous. Round and round we pattered, I and the gaunt wolves, over the dim tracks worn by the feet of disappointment and suffering. We waded knee-deep through a wavering sea of steamy blue flame, that rose from the remains and bespattered us from head to heel, stumbling and tripping and groping and cursing our fates, each in his separate tongue, while the night waned, the dew fell clammy and cold into our prison, and the stars, who looked down upon us from the free purple sky overhead, made a dim twilight in our cell. I was blundering and staggering round the walls for the 100th time, feeling about with my hands in a hopeless search for some cleft or opening, when the grimmest thing of the whole evening happened. In a lonely corner of the den, in a little recess not searched before, pattering about in the dark, I suddenly touched with my hand, think with what a shock it thrilled me, the cloth-clad shoulder of a man. With a gasp and a cry I leapt back, and stood trembling and staring into the shadows, scarcely daring to breathe. Much as I had suffered in that hideous place, nothing affected me half so much as dropping my hand upon that dreadful shoulder. Heaven knows we were all cowards down there, but for a minute I was the biggest coward of us, and felt full of those strange throes of superstitious terror that I had often wondered before to hear weaker men describe. Then I mustered my wavering spirit, and with the gaunt wolves squatting in a luminous circle around me, went into the recess again, and put my hand once more upon my grim companion. The coat upon him was dry and rough with age, and beneath it, I could tell by the touch, there was nothing but bare rattling bones. I stood still, grimly waiting for the flutter of my physical cowardice to subside, and then I thought of that second match, and in a moment of keen intensity, with such care as you may imagine, struck it against the wall. It lit, and at my feet, in ragged miner's garb, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his chin upon them, was the skeleton of a man so bleached and dry that it must have been there for 50 years at least. At his side lay his miner's pick and pannikin, an old dusty pocket Bible, the fragments of a felt hat, and a pair of heavy boots, still neatly side by side, just as the luckless fellow had placed the well-worn things when for some reason he last took them off. And overhead something scratched upon a flat face of the rock. Hastily I snatched a scrap of paper from my pocket, and lighting it at the expiring match, read on the stone, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. There was nothing but that, and even the Wednesday was unfinished, dying away in a shaky, uncertain scratch that spoke infinitely more plainly than many words would have done of the growing feebleness of the hand that traced it. And then all was darkness again. I crept back to my distant corner and crouched like the dead man against the wall, with my chin upon my knees, and kept repeating to myself the horrible simplicity of that diary, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Poor, nameless Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And was this to be my fate? I laughed bitterly. I would begin such another record with the first streak of dawn, and in the meantime I would sleep, whatever befell, and sleep I did, with those restless blue wolves cantering round the well-worn paths of the charnel house to their own hideous music, the silent unknown away in the distance, and the opal eyes of the great serpent staring at me like baleful planets, cold, sullen, and cruel, from between the dead man's feet. It was a shout that woke me next morning, a clear ringing shout that jerked me from dreadful dreams. I scrambled to my feet and saw from the bright light above me that it was day above, and while I still staggered and wandered stupidly, again came that shout. I stared up overhead where the sunlight was making the neck of the trap a disk of intolerable brightness, and there, when my eyes grew accustomed to that shining, was a round something that presently resolved itself into the blessed face of my steadfast chum Will Hartland. There is little need to say more. With the help of his strong cow rope at his saddle bow and a round point of earth-embedded rock as purchase, he had me out of that accursed hole in an incredibly, ridiculously short space of time, and there I was, leaning on his shoulder, free again, in the first flush of as glorious a morning as you could wish for, with the San Juan away in the distance, winding in a sapphire streak through miles of emerald forests, a sweet blue sky above, and underneath the earth wet with morning mist, smelling like a wine cooler, and every bent twig underfoot gemmed with glittering prismatic dewdrops. I sat down on a stone, and after a long pull at Will's flask, told him something like the narrative I have just given. And when the tale was done, I paused a minute, and then said somewhat shyly, "And now I'm going back, Will, old man, back for those poor devils down yonder who haven't a chance for their lives unless I do." Will, who had listened to my narrative with horror and wonder flitting across his honest brown face, started up at this as though he thought the night's adventure had fairly turned my head. But he was a good fellow, chivalrous and tender of heart under his Mexican jacket, and speedily acknowledging that I was right, set to work to help me. Down I went, back into the pit, the very sight and shadow of which now made me sick, and with the noose end of Will's lasso, he holding the other end above, set to work to secure those poor beasts who whined and crowded round my legs in hideous glee to have me back again amongst them. 'Twas easy work. They were stupid and heavy and seemed to have time, and when a wolf was fast, shouted to Will, who hauled some idea of my intentions, and thus I noosed them one at a time with scant ceremony, and up the grey ghoul went into that sunshine he had not seen for many weeks, until he and all his comrades were free once more, spinning and struggling and yelping, truly a wonderful sight. But nothing would move the python. I followed him round and round, trying all I knew to get his cruel, cynical head through the noose, and then, when he had refused it a dozen times, I grew angry and cursed him, and gathering up all the tortoises, lizards, and lesser beasts I could find into my waistband, ascended into the sweet outer air once more. A very few hours afterwards, a heavy blasting charge, fetched from a neighbouring mine, was dangling by a string just inside the mouth of the detestable trap, with its fuse burning brightly. A few minutes of suspense, a mighty crash, a cloud of white smoke hanging over the green hilltop, and one of the most treacherous places that ever marred the face of nature's sweet earth was a harmless heap of dust and tumbled stones. The end of A Dreadful Night by Edwin Lester Arnold, recorded by Peter Yearsley.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Japan Box by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It was a curious thing, said the private tutor. One of those grotesque and whimsical incidents which occur to one as one goes through life. I lost the best situation which I am ever likely to have through it. But I am glad that I went to Thorpe Place, for I gained— well, as I tell you the story, you will learn what I gained. I don't know whether you are familiar with that part of the Midlands which is drained by the Avon. It is the most English part of England. Shakespeare, the flower of our whole race, was born right in the middle of it. It is a land of rolling pastures, rising in the higher folds to the westwards, until they swell into the Malvern Hills. There are no towns, but numerous villages, each with its grey Norman church. You have left the brick of the southern and eastern counties behind you, and everything is stone. Stone for the walls, and lichened slabs of stone for the roofs. It is all grim and solid and massive, as befits the heart of a great nation. It was in the middle of this country, not far from Evesham, that Sir John Bollamore lived in the old ancestral home of Thorpe Place, and thither it was that I came to teach his two little sons. Sir John was a widower. His wife had died 3 years before, and he had been left with these two lads, aged 8 and 10, and one dear little girl of 7. Miss Witherton, who is now my wife, was governess to this little girl. I was tutor to the two boys. Could there be a more obvious prelude to an engagement? She governs me now, and I tutor two little boys of our own. But there, I have already revealed what it was which I gained in Thorpe Place. It was a very, very old house, incredibly old, pre-Norman, some of it, and the Bollamores claimed to have lived in that situation since long before the Conquest. It struck a chill to my heart when I first came there, those enormously thick grey walls, the crude crumbling stones, the smell as from a sick animal which exhaled from the rotting plaster of the aged building. But the modern wing was bright and the garden was well kept. No house could be dismal which had a pretty girl inside it and such a show of roses in front. Apart from a very complete staff of servants, there were only 4 of us in the household. These were Miss Witherton, who was at that time 24 and as pretty, well, as pretty as Miss Colmore is now. Myself, Frank Colmore, aged 30, Mrs. Stevens, the housekeeper, a dry, silent woman, and Mr. Richards, a tall, military-looking man who acted as steward to the Bollamore estates. We 4 always had our meals together, but Sir John had his usually alone in the library. Sometimes he joined us at dinner, but on the whole we were just as glad when he did not. For he was a very formidable person. Imagine a man 6 feet 3 inches in height, majestically built, with a high-nosed, aristocratic face, brindled hair, shaggy eyebrows, a small, pointed, Mephistophelian beard, and lines upon his brow and round his eyes as deep as if they had been carved with a penknife. He had grey eyes, weary, hopeless-looking eyes, proud and yet pathetic, eyes which claimed your pity and yet dared you to show it. His back was rounded with study, but otherwise he was as fine a looking man of his age, 55 perhaps, as any woman would wish to look upon. But his presence was not a cheerful one. He was always courteous, always refined, but singularly silent and retiring. I have never lived so long with any man and had known so little of him. If he were indoors, he spent his time either in his own small study in the eastern tower, or in the library in the modern wing. So regular was his routine that one could always say at any hour exactly where he would be. Twice in the day he would visit his study, once after breakfast and once about 10 at night. You might set your watch by the slam of the heavy door. For the rest of the day he would be in his library, save that for an hour or 2 in the afternoon he would take a walk or a ride, which was solitary like the rest of his existence. He loved his children and was keenly interested in the progress of their studies, but they were a little awed by the silent, shaggy-browed figure, and they avoided him as much as they could. Indeed, we all did that. It was some time before I came to know anything about the circumstances of Sir John Bollamore's life, for Mrs. Stevens, the housekeeper, and Mr. Richards, the land steward, were too loyal to talk easily of their employer's affairs. As to the governess, she knew no more than I did, and our common interest was one of the causes which drew us together. At last, however, an incident occurred which led to a closer acquaintance with Mr. Richards and a fuller knowledge of the life of the man whom I served. The immediate cause of this was no less than the falling of Master Percy, the youngest of my pupils, into the mill race, with imminent danger both to his life and to mine, since I had to risk myself in order to save him. Dripping and exhausted, for I was far more spent than the child, I was making for my room when Sir John, who had heard the hubbub, opened the door of his little study and asked me what was the matter. I told him of the accident, but assured him that his child was in no danger, while he listened with a rugged, immobile face, which expressed in his intense eyes, the tightened lips, all the emotion which he tried to conceal. "One moment! Step in here! Let me have the details," said he, turning back through the open door. And so I found myself within that little sanctum, inside which, as I afterwards learned, no other foot had for 3 years been set save that of the old servant who cleaned it out. It was a round room, conforming to the shape of the tower in which it was situated, with a low ceiling, a single, narrow, ivy-wreathed window, and the simplest of furniture. An old carpet, a single chair, a deal table, and a small shelf of books made up the whole contents. On the table stood a full-length photograph of a woman. I took no particular notice of the features, but I remember that a certain gracious gentleness had the prevailing impression. Beside it were a large black Japan box and 1 or 2 bundles of letters or papers fastened together with elastic bands. Our interview was a short one, for Sir John Bollamore perceived that I was soaked and that I should change without delay. The incident led, however, to an instructive talk with Richards, the agent, who had never penetrated into the chamber which chance had opened to me. That very afternoon he came to me, all curiosity, and walked up and down the garden path with me, while my two charges played tennis upon the lawn beside us. "You hardly realize the exception which has been made in your favor," said he. "That room has been kept such a mystery, and Sir John's visits to it have been so regular and consistent, that an almost superstitious feeling has arisen about it in the household. I assure you that if I were to repeat to you the tales which are flying about, tales of mysterious visitors there, and of voices overheard by the servants, you might suspect that Sir John had relapsed into his old ways." "Why do you say relapsed?" I asked. He looked at me in surprise. "Is it possible that Sir John Bollamore's previous history is unknown to you?" "Absolutely." "You astound me. I thought that every man in England knew something of his antecedents. I should not mention the matter if it were not that you are now one of ourselves, and that the facts might come out to your ears in some harsher form if I were silent upon them. I always took it for granted that you knew you were in the service of Devil Bollamore." "But why devil?" I asked. "Ah, you are young and the world moves fast, but 20 years ago the name of Devil Bollamore was one of the best known in London. He was the leader of a fastest set, bruiser, driver, gambler, drunkard, a survival of the old type, and as bad as the worst of them." I stared at him in amazement. That quiet, studious, sad-faced man? The greatest rip and debauchee in England. All between ourselves, Colmore. But you understand now what I mean when I say that a woman's voice in his room might even now give rise to suspicions. But what can have changed him so? Little Beryl Clare, when she took the risk of becoming his wife. That was the turning point. He had got so far that his own fast set had thrown him over. There's a world of difference, you know, between a man who drinks and a drunkard. They all drink, but they taboo a drunkard. He had become a slave to it, hopeless and helpless. Then she stepped in, saw the possibilities of a fine man in the wreck, took her chance in marrying him though she might have had the pick of a dozen, and, by devoting her life to it, brought him back to manhood and decency. You have observed that no liquor is ever kept in the house. There never has been any since her foot crossed its threshold. A drop of it would be like blood to a tiger even now. Then her influence still holds him? That is the wonder of it. When she died 3 years ago, we all expected and feared that he would fall back into his old ways. She feared it herself, and the thought gave a terror to death, for she was like a guardian angel to that man, and lived only for the one purpose. By the way, did you see a black Japan box in his room?" "Yes." "I fancy it contains her letters. If ever he has occasion to be away, if only for a single night, he invariably takes his black Japan box with him. Well, well, Colmore, perhaps I have told you rather more than I should, but I shall expect you to reciprocate if anything of interest should come to your knowledge." I could see that the worthy man was consumed with curiosity and just a little piqued that I, the newcomer, should have been the first to penetrate into the untrodden chamber. But the fact raised me in his esteem, and from that time onwards I found myself upon more confidential terms with him. And now the silent and majestic figure of my employer became an object of greater interest to me. I began to understand that strangely human look in his eyes, those deep lines upon his careworn face. He was a man who was fighting a ceaseless battle, holding at arm's length, from morning till night, a horrible adversary who was forever trying to close with him, an adversary which would destroy him, body and soul, could it but fix its claws once more upon him. As I watched the grim, round-backed figure pacing the corridor or walking in the garden, this imminent danger seemed to take bodily shape, and I could almost fancy that I saw this most loathsome and dangerous of all the fiends crouching closely in his very shadow, like a half-cowed beast which slinks beside its keeper, ready at any unguarded moment to spring at his throat. And the dead woman, the woman who had spent her life in warding off this danger, took shape also in my imagination, and I saw her as a shadowy but beautiful presence which intervened forever with arms uplifted to screen the man whom she loved. In some subtle way he divined the sympathy which I had for him, and he showed in his own silent fashion that he appreciated it. He even invited me once to share his afternoon walk, and although no word passed between us on this occasion, it was a mark of confidence which he had never shown to anyone before. He asked me also to index his library. It was one of the best private libraries in England, and I spent many hours in the evening in his presence, if not in his society, he reading at his desk and I sitting in a recess by the window reducing to order the chaos which existed among his books. In spite of these close relations, I was never again asked to enter the chamber in the turret. And then came my revulsion of feeling. A single incident changed all my sympathy to loathing, and made me realize that my employer still remained all that he ever had been, with the additional vice of hypocrisy. One evening Miss Witherton had gone down to Broadway, the neighboring village, to sing at a concert for some charity, and I, according to my promise, had walked over to escort her back. The drive sweeps round under the eastern turret, and I observed as I passed that the light was lit in the circular room. It was a summer evening, and the window, which was a little higher than our heads, was open. We were, as it happened, engrossed in our own conversation at the moment when we paused upon the lawn which skirts the old turret, when suddenly something broke in upon our talk and turned our thoughts away from our own affairs. It was a voice, the voice undoubtedly of a woman. It was low, so low that it was only in the still night air that we could have heard it, but, hushed as it was, there was no mistaking its feminine timbre. It spoke hurriedly, gaspingly for a few sentences, and then was silent, a piteous, breathless, imploring sort of voice. Miss Witherton and I stood for an instant staring at each other. Then we walked quickly in the direction of the hall door. "It came through the window," I said. "We must not play the part of eavesdroppers," she answered. "We must forget that we ever heard it." There was an absence of surprise in her manner that suggested a new idea to me. I cried, "You have heard it before." "I could not help it. My own room is higher up on the same turret. It has happened frequently." "Who can the woman be?" "I have no idea. I had rather not discuss it." Her voice was enough to show me what she thought. But granting that our employer led a double and dubious life, who could she be, this mysterious woman who kept him company in the old tower? I knew from my own inspection how bleak and bare a room it was. She certainly did not live there. But in that case, where did she come from? It could not be any one of the household. They were all under the vigilant eyes of Mrs. Stevens. The visitor must come from without. But how? And then suddenly I remembered how ancient this building was, and how probable that some medieval passage existed in it. There is hardly an old castle without one. The mysterious room was the basement of the turret, so that if there were anything of the sort, it would open through the floor. There were numerous cottages in the immediate vicinity. The other end of the secret passage might lie among some tangle of bramble in the neighboring copse. I had said nothing to anyone, but I felt that the secret of my employer lay within my power. And the more convinced I was of this, the more I marveled at the manner in which he concealed his true nature. Often, as I watched his austere figure, I asked myself if it were indeed possible that such a man should be living this double life, and I tried to persuade myself that my suspicions might after all prove to be ill-founded. But there was the female voice, there was the secret nightly rendezvous in the turret chamber. How could such facts admit an innocent interpretation? I conceived a horror of the man. I was filled with loathing at his deep, consistent hypocrisy. Only once during all those months did I ever see him without that sad but impassive mask which he usually presented towards his fellow man. For an instant I caught a glimpse of those volcanic fires which he had damped down so long. The occasion was an unworthy one, for the object of his wrath was none other than the aged charwoman whom I have already mentioned as being the one person who was allowed within his mysterious chamber. I was passing the corridor which led to the turret, for my own room lay in that direction, when I heard a sudden, startled scream, and merged in it the husky, growling note of a man who is inarticulate with passion. It was the snarl of a furious wild beast. Then I heard his voice thrilling with anger. "You would dare," he cried, "you would dare to disobey my directions?" An instant later the charwoman passed me, flying down the passage, white-faced and tremulous, while the terrible voice thundered behind her. "Go to Mrs. Stevens for your money. Never set foot in Thorpe Place again." Consumed with curiosity, I could not help following the woman, and found her round the corner, leaning against a wall and palpitating like a frightened rabbit. "What is the matter, Mrs. Brown?" I asked. "It's master," she gasped. "Oh, how he frightened me! If you had seen his eyes, Mr. Colmore, sir! I thought he would have been the death of me." "But what had you done?" "Done, sir? Nothing. At least nothing to make so much of. Just laid my hand on that black box of his. Hadn't even opened it, when in he came, and you heard the way he went on. I've lost my place, and I'm glad of it, for I would never trust myself within reach of him again." So it was the japanned box which was the cause of this outburst, the box from which he would never permit himself to be separated. What was the connection, or was there any connection, between this and the secret visits of the lady whose voice I overheard? Sir John Bollamore's wrath was enduring as well as fiery, for from that day Mrs. Brown, the chairwoman, vanished from our ken, and Thorpe Place knew her no more. And now I wish to tell you the singular chance which solved all these strange questions and put my employer's secret in my possession. The story may leave you with some lingering doubts as to whether my curiosity did not get the better of my honor, and whether I did not condescend to play the spy. If you choose to think so, I cannot help it, but I can only assure you that, improbable as it may appear, the matter came about exactly as I describe it. The first stage in this denouement was that the small room in the turret became uninhabitable. This occurred through the fall of the worm-eaten oaken beam which supported the ceiling. Rotten with age, it snapped in the middle one morning, and it brought down a quantity of plaster with it. Fortunately, Sir John was not in the room at the time. His precious box was rescued from amongst the debris and brought into the library, where, henceforward, it was locked within his bureau. Sir John took no steps to repair the damage, and I never had an opportunity of searching for that secret passage, the existence of which I had surmised. As to the lady, I had thought that this would have brought her visits to an end, had I not one evening heard Mr. Richards asking Mrs. Stevens who the woman was whom he had overheard talking to Sir John in the library. I could not catch her reply, but I saw from her manner that it was not the first time that she had had to answer or avoid the same question. "You've heard the voice, Colmore?" said the agent. I confessed that I had. "And what do you think of it?" I shrugged my shoulders and remarked that it was no business of mine. Come, you are just as curious as any of us. Is it a woman or not?" "It is certainly a woman." "Which room did you hear it from?" "From the turret room, before the ceiling fell." "But I heard it from the library only last night. I passed the doors as I was going to bed, and I heard something wailing and praying just as plainly as I hear you. It may be a woman. Why, what else could it be?" He looked at me hard. "There are more things in heaven and earth. If it is a woman, how does she get in there?" "I don't know." "No, nor I. But if it is the other thing... But there, for a practical business man at the end of the 19th century, this is rather a ridiculous line of conversation." He turned away, but I saw that he felt even more than he had said. To all the old ghost stories of Thorpe Place, a new one was being added before our very eyes. It may by this time have taken its permanent place, for though an explanation came to me, it never reached the others. And my explanation came in this way. I had suffered a sleepless night from neuralgia, and about midday I had taken a heavy dose of chlorodyne to alleviate the pain. At that time I was finishing the indexing of Sir John Bollamore's library, and it was my custom to work there from 5 until 7. On this particular day I struggled against the double effect of my bad night and the narcotic. I have already mentioned that there was a recess in the library, and in this it was my habit to work. I settled down steadily to my task, but my weariness overcame me, and, falling back upon the settee, I dropped into a heavy sleep. How long I slept I do not know, but it was quite dark when I awoke. Confused by the chlorodyne which I had taken, I lay motionless in a semi-conscious state. The great room with its high walls covered with books loomed darkly all around me. A dim radiance from the moonlight came through the farther window, and against this lighter background I saw that Sir John Bollamore was sitting at his study table. His well-set head and clearly cut profile were sharply outlined against the glimmering square behind him. He bent as I watched him, and I heard the sharp turning of a key and the rasping of metal upon metal. As if in a dream, I was vaguely conscious that this was the japanned box which stood in front of him, and that he had drawn something out of it, something squat and uncouth, which now lay before him upon the table. I never realized, it never occurred to my bemuddled and torpid brain, that I was intruding upon his privacy, and that he imagined himself to be alone in the room. And then, just as it rushed upon my horrified perceptions, and I had half risen to announce my presence, I heard a strange, crisp, metallic clicking, and then the voice. Yes, it was a woman's voice. There could be not a doubt of it. But a voice so charged with entreaty and with yearning love that it will ring forever in my ears. It came with a curious, far-away tinkle, but every word was clear, though faint, very faint, for they were the last words of a dying woman. "I am not really gone, John," said the thin, gasping voice. "I am here at your very elbow, and shall be until we meet once more. I die happy to think that morning and night you will hear my voice. Oh, John, be strong, until we meet again." I say that I had risen in order to announce my presence, but could not do so while the voice was sounding. I could only remain half lying, half sitting, paralyzed, astounded, listening to those yearning, distant, musical words. And he was so absorbed that even if I had spoken he might not have heard me. But with the silence of the voice came my half-articulated apologies and explanations. He sprang across the room, switched on the electric light, and in its white glare I saw him, his eyes gleaming with anger, his face twisted with passion, as the hapless chairwoman may have seen weeks before. "Mr. Colmore!" he cried. "You here! What is the meaning of this, sir?" With halting words I explained it all, my neuralgia, the narcotic, my luckless sleep and singular awakening. As he listened the glow of anger faded from his face, and the sad, impassive mask closed once more over his features. "My secret is yours, Mr. Colmore," he said. "I have only myself to blame for relaxing my precautions. Half-confidences are worse than no confidences, and so you may well know all, since you know so much. The story may go where you will when I have passed away, but until then I rely upon your sense of honor that no human soul shall hear of it from your lips. I am proud still, God help me, or, at least, I am proud enough to resent the pity which this story would draw upon me. I have smiled at envy and disregarded hatred, but pity is more than I can tolerate. You have heard the source from which the voice comes, that voice which has, as I understand, excited so much curiosity in my household. I am aware of the rumors to which it has given rise. These speculations, whether scandalous or superstitious, are such as I can disregard and forgive. What I should never forgive would be a disloyal spying and eavesdropping in order to satisfy an illicit curiosity. But of that, Mr. Colmore, I acquit you. When I was a young man, sir, many years younger than you are now, I was launched upon town without a friend or adviser, and with a purse which brought only too many false friends and false advisers to my side. I drank deeply of the wine of life. If there is a man living who has drunk more deeply, he is not a man whom I envy. My purse suffered, my character suffered, my constitution suffered, stimulants became a necessity to me. I was a creature for whom my memory recoils. And it was at that time, the time of my blackest degradation, that God sent into my life the gentlest, sweetest spirit that ever descended as a ministering angel from above. She loved me, broken as I was, loved me, and spent her life in making a man once more of that which had degraded itself into the level of the beasts. But a fell disease struck her, and she withered away before my eyes. In the hour of her agony it was never of herself, of her own sufferings and her own death that she thought. It was all of me. The one pang which her fate brought to her was the fear, when her influence was removed, I should revert to that which I had been. It was in vain that I made oath to her and that no drop of wine would ever cross my lips. She knew only too well the hold that the devil had upon me, she who had striven so to loosen it, and it haunted her night and day, the thought that my soul might again be within his grip. It was from some friend's gossip of the sick room that she heard of this invention, this phonograph, and with the quick insight of a loving woman, she saw how she might use it for her ends. She sent me to London to procure the best which money could buy. With her dying breath she gasped into it the words which have held me straight ever since. Lonely and broken, what else have I in all the world to uphold me? But it is enough. Please God, I shall face her without shame when He is pleased to reunite us. That is my secret, Mr. Colmore, and whilst I live I leave it in your keeping. The Japan Box by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Read by Scott Bush. January 8th, 2007.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by William Kuhn. November 2006. The Mark of the Beast by Rudyard Kipling. Your gods and my gods, do you or I know which are the stronger? Native proverb. East of Suez, some hold, the direct control of Providence ceases, man being there handed over to the power of the gods and devils of Asia, and the Church of England Providence only exercising an occasional and modified supervision in the case of Englishmen. This theory accounts for some of the more unnecessary horrors of life in India. It may be stretched to explain my story. My friend Strickland of the police, who knows as much of natives of India as is good for any man, can bear witness to the facts of the case. Dumoise, our doctor, also saw what Strickland and I saw. The inference which he drew from the evidence was entirely incorrect. He is dead now. He died in a rather curious manner, which has been elsewhere described. When Fleet came to India, he owned a little money and some land in the Himalayas, near a place called Dharmsala. Both properties had been left him by an uncle, and he came out to finance them. He was a big, heavy, genial, and inoffensive man. His knowledge of natives was, of course, limited, and he complained of the difficulties of the language. He rode in from his place in the hills to spend New Year in the station, and he stayed with Strickland. On New Year's Eve there was a big dinner at the club, and the night was excusably wet. When men foregather from the utmost ends of the empire, they have a right to be riotous. The frontier had sent down a contingent of catch-em-alive-os who had not seen 20 white faces for a year, and were used to ride 15 miles to dinner at the next fort, at the risk of a Khyberee bullet where their drinks should lie. They profited by their new security, for they tried to play pool with a curled-up hedgehog found in the garden, and one of them carried the marker round the room in his teeth. Half a dozen planters had come in from the south and were talking horse to the biggest liar in Asia, who was trying to cap all their stories at once. Everybody was there, and there was a general closing up of ranks and taking stock of our losses in dead or disabled that had fallen during the past year. It was a very wet night, and I remember that we sang Auld Lang Syne with our feet in the Polo Championship Cup and our heads among the stars, and swore that we were all dear friends. Then some of us went away and annexed Burma, and some tried to open up the Sudan and were opened up by fuzzies in that cruel scrub outside Suakim, and some found stars and medals, and some were married, which was bad, and some did other things which were worse, and the others of us stayed in our chairs and strove to make money on insufficient experiences. Fleet began the night with sherry and bitters, drank champagne steadily up to dessert, then raw, rasping Capri with all the strength of whiskey, took Benedictine with his coffee, 4 or 5 whiskies and sodas to improve his pool strokes, beer and bones at 2:30, winding up with old brandy. Consequently, when he came out at 3:30 in the morning, into 14 degrees of frost, he was very angry with his horse for coughing, and tried to leapfrog into the saddle. The horse broke away and went to his stables, so Strickland and I formed a guard of dishonor to take Fleet home. Our road lay through the bazaar, close to a little temple of Hanuman, the monkey god, who was a leading divinity worthy of respect. All gods have good points, just as have all priests. Personally, I attach much importance to Hanuman, and am kind to his people, the great gray apes of the hills. One never knows when one may want a friend. There was a light in the temple, and as we passed we could hear voices of men chanting hymns. In a native temple the priests rise at all hours of the night to do honor to their god. Before we could stop him, Fleet dashed up the steps, patted 2 priests on the back, and was gravely grinding the ashes of his cigar butt into the forehead of the red stone image of Hanuman. Strickland tried to drag him out, but he sat down and said solemnly, "See that? Mark of the beast. I made it. Isn't it fine?" In half a minute the temple was alive and noisy, and Strickland, who knew what came of polluting gods, said that things might occur. He, by virtue of his official position, long resided in the country, and weakness for going among the natives was known to the priests, and he felt unhappy. Fleet sat on the ground and refused to move. He said that good old Hanuman made a very soft pillow. Then, without any warning, a silver man came out of a recess behind the image of the god. He was perfectly naked in that bitter, bitter cold, and his body shone like frosted silver, for he was what the Bible calls a leper as white as snow. Also he had no face, because he was a leper of some years' standing, and his disease was heavy upon him. We too stooped to haul Fleet up, and the temple was filling and filling with folk who seemed to spring from the earth, when the silver man ran in under our arms, making a noise exactly like the mewing of an otter, caught Fleet round the body, and dropped his head on Fleet's breast before we could wrench him away. Then he retired to a corner and sat mewing, while the crowd blocked all the doors. The priests were very angry until the silver man touched Fleet. That nuzzling seemed to sober them. At the end of a few minutes' silence one of the priests came to Strickland and said in perfect English, "Take your friend away. He has done with Hanuman, but Hanuman has not done with him." The crowd gave room, and we carried Fleet into the road. Strickland was very angry. He said that we might all 3 have been knifed, and that Fleet should thank his stars that he had escaped without injury. Fleet thanked no one. He said that he wanted to go to bed. He was gorgeously drunk. We moved on, Strickland silent and wrathful, until Fleet was taken with violent shivering fits and sweating. He said that the smells of the bazaar were overpowering, and he wondered why slaughter-houses were permitted so near English residences. "Can't you smell the blood?" said Fleet. We put him to bed at last, just as the dawn was breaking, and Strickland invited me to have another whiskey and soda. While we were drinking he talked of the trouble in the temple, and admitted that it baffled him completely. Strickland hates being mystified by natives, because his business in life is to overmatch them with their own weapons. He has not yet succeeded in doing this, but in 15 or 20 years he will have made some small progress. "They should have mauled us," he said, "instead of mewing at us. I wonder what they meant. I don't like it one little bit." I said that the managing committee of the temple would in all probability bring a criminal action against us for insulting their religion. There was a section of the Indian Penal Code which exactly met Fleet's offense. Strickland said he only hoped and prayed that they would do this. Before I left I looked into Fleet's room, and saw him lying on his right side, scratching his left breast. Then I went to bed, cold, depressed, and unhappy, at 7 o'clock in the morning. At 1 o'clock I rode over to Strickland's house to inquire after Fleet's head. I imagined that it would be a sore one. Fleet was breakfasting and seemed unwell. His temper was gone, for he was abusing the cook for not supplying him with an underdone chop. A man who can eat raw meat after a wet night is a curiosity. I told Fleet this, and he laughed. "You breed queer mosquitoes in these parts," he said. "I've been bitten to pieces, but only in one place." "Let's have a look at the bite," said Strickland. "It may have gone down since this morning." While the chops were being cooked, Fleet opened his shirt and showed us, just over his left breast, a mark, the perfect double of the black rosettes, the 5 or 6 irregular blotches arranged in a circle, on a leopard's hide. Strickland looked and said, "It was only pink this morning. It's grown black now." Fleet ran to a glass. "By Jove," he said, "this is nasty. What is it?" We could not answer. Here the chops came in, all red and juicy, and Fleet bolted 3 in a most offensive manner. He ate on his right grinders only, and threw his head over his right shoulder as he snapped the meat. When he had finished, it struck him that he had been behaving strangely, for he said apologetically, "I don't think I ever felt so hungry in my life. I bolted like an ostrich." After breakfast Strickland said to me, "Don't go. Stay here, and stay for the night." Seeing that my house was not 3 miles from Strickland's, this request was absurd. But Strickland insisted, and was going to say something when Fleet interrupted by declaring in a shamefaced way that he felt hungry again. Strickland sent a man to my house to fetch over my bedding and a horse, and we 3 went down to Strickland's stables to pass the hours until it was time to go out for a ride. The man who has a weakness for horses never wearies of inspecting them, and when 2 men are killing time in this way, they gather knowledge and lies the one from the other. There were 5 horses in the stables, and I shall never forget the scene as we tried to look them over. They seemed to have gone mad. They reared and screamed and nearly tore up their pickets. They sweated and shivered and lathered and were distraught with fear. Strickland's horses used to know him as well as his dogs, which made the matter more curious. We left the stable for fear of the brutes throwing themselves in their panic. Then Strickland turned back and called me. The horses were still frightened, but they let us gentle and make much of them, and put their heads in our bosoms. "They aren't afraid of us," said Strickland. "Do you know, I'd give 3 months' pay if Outrage here could talk." But Outrage was dumb, and could only cuddle up to his master and blow out his nostrils, as is the custom of horses when they wish to explain things but can't. Fleet came up when they were in the stalls, and as soon as the horses saw him, their fright broke out afresh. It was all that we could do to escape from the place unkicked. Strickland said, "They don't seem to love you, Fleet." "Nonsense," said Fleet. "My mare will follow me like a dog." He went to her. She was in a loose box, but as he slipped the bars she plunged, knocked him down, and broke away into the garden. I laughed, but Strickland was not amused. He took his mustache in both fists and pulled at it till it nearly came out. Fleet, instead of going off to chase his property, yawned, saying that he felt sleepy. He went to the house to lie down, which was a foolish way of spending New Year's Day. Strickland sat with me in the stables and asked if I had noticed anything peculiar in Fleet's manner. I said that he ate his food like a beast, but that this might have been the result of living alone in the hills, out of the reach of society as refined and elevating as ours, for instance. Strickland was not amused. I do not think that he listened to me, for his next sentence referred to the mark on Fleet's breast, and I said that it might have been caused by blister flies, or that it was possibly a birthmark, newly born, and now visible for the first time. We both agreed that it was unpleasant to look at, and Strickland found occasion to say that I was a fool. "I can't tell you what I think now," he said, "because you would call me a madman. But you must stay with me for the next few days, if you can. I want you to watch Fleet, but don't tell me what you think till I have made up my mind." "But I am dining out tonight," I said. "So am I," said Strickland, "and so is Fleet. At least if he doesn't change his mind." We walked about the garden smoking, but saying nothing, because we were friends and talking spoils good tobacco, till our pipes were out. Then we went to wake up Fleet. He was wide awake and fidgeting about his room. "I say, I want some more chops," he said. "Can I get them?" We laughed and said, "Go and change. The ponies will be round in a minute." "All right," said Fleet. "I'll go when I get the chops. Underdone ones, mind." He seemed to be quite in earnest. It was 4 o'clock, and we had had breakfast at 1. Still, for a long time he demanded those underdone chops. Then he changed into riding clothes and went out into the veranda. His pony, the mare had not been caught, would not let him come near. All 3 horses were unmanageable, mad with fear, and finally Fleet said that he would stay at home and get something to eat. Strickland and I rode out, wondering. As we passed the temple of Hanuman, the Silver Man came out and mewed at us. "He is not one of the regular priests of the temple," said Strickland. "I think I should peculiarly like to lay my hands on him." There was no spring in our gallop on the racecourse that evening. The horses were stale, and moved as though they had been ridden out. "The fright after breakfast has been too much for them," said Strickland. That was the only remark he made through the remainder of the ride. Once or twice I think he swore to himself, but that did not count. We came back in the dark at 7 o'clock, and saw that there were no lights in the bungalow. "Careless ruffians my servants are," said Strickland. My horse reared at something on the carriage drive, and Fleet stood up under its nose. "What are you doing grovelling about the garden?" said Strickland. But both horses bolted and nearly threw us. We dismounted by the stables and returned to Fleet, who was on his hands and knees under the orange bushes. "What the devil's wrong with you?" said Strickland. Nothing in the world," said Fleet, speaking very quickly and thickly. "I've been gardening, botanizing, you know. The smell of the earth is delightful. I think I'm going for a walk. A long walk. All night." Then I saw that there was something excessively out of order somewhere, and I said to Strickland, "I am not dining out." "Bless you," said Strickland. "Here, Fleet, get up. You'll catch fever there. Come in to dinner and let's have the lamps lit. We'll all dine at home." Fleet stood up unwillingly and said, No lamps. It's much nicer here. Let's dine outside and have some more chops. Lots of 'em, and underdone, bloody ones with gristle." Now a December evening in northern India is bitterly cold, and Fleet's suggestion was that of a maniac. "Come in," said Strickland sternly. "Come in at once." Fleet came, and when the lamps were brought, we saw that he was literally plastered with dirt from head to foot. He must have been rolling in the garden. He shrank from the light and went to his room. His eyes were horrible to look at. There was a green light behind them, not in them, if you understand, and the man's lower lip hung down. Strickland said, "There is going to be trouble, big trouble, tonight. Don't you change your riding things." We waited and waited for Fleet's reappearance, and ordered dinner in the meantime. We could hear him moving about his own room, but there was no light there. Presently from the room came the long-drawn howl of a wolf. People write and talk lightly of blood running cold and hair standing up and things of that kind. Both sensations are too horrible to be trifled with. My heart stopped as though a knife had been driven through it, and Strickland turned as white as the tablecloth. The howl was repeated, and was answered by another howl far across the fields. That set the gilded roof on the horror. Strickland dashed into Fleet's room. I followed, and we saw Fleet getting out of the window. He made beast noises in the back of his throat. He could not answer us when we shouted at him. He spat. I don't quite remember what followed, but I think that Strickland must have stunned him with the long boot-jack, or else I should never have been able to sit on his chest. Fleet could not speak. He could only snarl, and his snarls were those of a wolf, not of a man. The human spirit must have been giving way all day and have died out with the twilight. We were dealing with a beast that had once been Fleet. The affair was beyond any human and rational experience. I tried to say hydrophobia, but the word wouldn't come, because I knew that I was lying. We bound this beast with leather thongs of the punka rope, and tied its thumbs and big toes together, and gagged it with a shoehorn, which makes a very efficient gag if you know how to arrange it. Then we carried it into the dining room, and sent a man to Dumoise, the doctor, telling him to come over at once. After we had dispatched the messenger and were drawing breath, Strickland said, "It's no good. This isn't any doctor's work." I also knew that he spoke the truth. The beast's head was free, and it threw it about from side to side. Anyone entering the room would have believed that we were curing a wolf's pelt. That was the most loathsome accessory of all. Strickland sat with his chin in the heel of his fist, watching the beast as it wriggled on the ground, but saying nothing. The shirt had been torn open in the scuffle and showed the black rosette mark on the left breast. It stood out like a blister. In the silence of the watching we heard something without, mewing like a she-otter. We both rose to our feet and, I answer for myself, not Strickland, felt sick, actually and physically sick. We told each other, as did the men in Pinafore, that it was the cat. Dumoise arrived, and I never saw a little man so unprofessionally shocked. He said that it was a heart-rending case of hydrophobia, and that nothing could be done. At least any palliative measures would only prolong the agony. The beast was foaming at the mouth. Fleet, as we told Dumoise, had been bitten by dogs once or twice. Any man who keeps half a dozen terriers must expect a nip now and again. Dumoise could offer no help. He could only certify that Fleet was dying of hydrophobia. The beast was then howling, for it had managed to spit out the shoehorn. Dumoise said that he would be ready to certify to the cause of death, and that the end was certain. He was a good little man, and he offered to remain with us, but Strickland refused the kindness. He did not wish to poison Dumoise' New Year. He would only ask him not to give the real cause of Fleet's death to the public. So Dumoise left, deeply agitated, and as soon as the noise of the cartwheels had died away, Strickland told me in a whisper his suspicions. They were so wildly improbable that he dared not say them out aloud, and I, who entertained all Strickland's beliefs, was so ashamed of owning to them that I pretended to disbelieve. Even if the Silver Man had bewitched Fleet for polluting the image of Hanuman, the punishment could not have fallen so quickly. As I was whispering this, the cry outside the house rose again, and the beast fell into a fresh paroxysm of struggling until we were afraid that the thongs that held it would give way. "Watch," said Strickland. "If this happens 6 times, I shall take the law into my own hands. I order you to help me." He went into his room and came out in a few minutes with the barrels of an old shotgun, a piece of fishing line, some thick cord, and his heavy wooden bedstead. I reported that the convulsions had followed the cry by 2 seconds in each case, and the beast seemed perceptibly weaker. Strickland muttered, But he can't take away the life. He can't take away the life. I said, though I knew that I was arguing against myself, "It may be a cat. It must be a cat. If the Silver Man is responsible, why does he dare to come here?" Strickland arranged the wood on the hearth, put the gun barrels into the glow of the fire, spread the twine on the table, and broke a walking stick in two. There was 1 yard of fishing line, gut, lapped with wire, such as is used for Manseer fishing, and he tied the two ends together in a loop. Then he said, "How can we catch him? He must be taken alive and unhurt." I said that we must trust in Providence, and go out softly with polo sticks into the shrubbery at the front of the house. The man or animal that made the cry was evidently moving round the house as regularly as a night watchman. We could wait in the bushes till he came by and knock him over. Strickland accepted this suggestion, and we slipped out from a bathroom window into the front veranda, and then across the carriage drive into the bushes. In the moonlight we could see the leper coming round the corner of the house. He was perfectly naked, and from time to time he mewed and stopped to dance with his shadow. It was an unattractive sight, and thinking of poor Fleet, brought to such degradation by so foul a creature, I put away all my doubts and resolved to help Strickland from the heated gun barrels to the loop of twine, from the loins to the head and back again, with all tortures that might be needful. The leper halted in the front porch for a moment, and we jumped out on him with the sticks. He was wonderfully strong, and we were afraid that he might escape or be fatally injured before we caught him. We had an idea that lepers were frail creatures, but this proved to be incorrect. Strickland knocked his legs from under him, and I put my foot on his neck. He mewed hideously, and even through my riding boots I could feel that his flesh was not the flesh of a clean man. He struck at us with his hand and feet stumps. We looped the lash of a dog whip around him, under the armpits, and dragged him backwards into the hall, and so into the dining room where the beast lay. There we tied him with trunk straps. He made no attempt to escape, but mewed. When we confronted him with the beast, the scene was beyond description. The beast doubled backwards into a bow as though he had been poisoned with strychnine, and moaned in the most pitiable fashion. Several other things happened also, but they cannot be put down here. "I think I was right," said Strickland. "Now we will ask him to cure this case." But the leper only mewed. Strickland wrapped a towel round his hand and took the gun barrels out of the fire. I put the half of the broken walking stick through the loop of the fishing line, and buckled the leper comfortably to Strickland's bedstead. I understood then how men and women and little children can endure to see a witch burnt alive, for the beast was moaning on the floor, and though the Silver Man had no face, you could see horrible feelings passing through the slab that took its place, exactly as waves of heat play across red-hot iron, gun barrels, for instance. Strickland shaded his eyes with his hands for a moment, and we got to work. This part is not to be printed. The dawn was beginning to break when the leper spoke. His mewings had not been satisfactory up to that point. The beast had fainted from exhaustion, and the house was very still. We unstrapped the leper and told him to take away the evil spirit. He crawled to the beast and laid his hand upon the left breast. That was all. Then he fell face down and whined, drawing in his breath as he did so. We watched the face of the beast, and saw the soul of Fleet coming back into the eyes. Then a sweat broke out on the forehead, and the eyes, they were human eyes, closed. We waited for an hour, but Fleet still slept. We carried him to his room and bade the leper go, giving him the bedstead and the sheet on the bedstead to cover his nakedness, the gloves and the towels with which we had touched him, and the whip that had been hooked around his body. He put the sheet about him and went out into the early morning without speaking or mewing. Strickland wiped his face and sat down. A night gong, far away in the city, made 7 o'clock. "Exactly 24 hours," said Strickland, "and I've done enough to ensure my dismissal from the service, besides permanent quarters in a lunatic asylum. Do you believe that we are awake?" The red-hot gun barrel had fallen on the floor and was singeing the carpet. The smell was entirely real. That morning at 11 we two together went to wake up Fleet. We looked and saw that the black leopard rosette on his chest had disappeared. He was very drowsy and tired, but as soon as he saw us he said, "Oh, confound you fellows! Happy New Year to you! Never mix your liquors. I'm nearly dead." "Thanks for your kindness, but you're over time," said Strickland. "Today is the morning of the 2nd. You've slept the clock round with a vengeance." The door opened, and little Dumoise put his head in. He had come on foot, and fancied that we were laying out Fleet. "I brought a nurse," said Dumoise. "I suppose that she can come in for what is necessary?" "By all means," said Fleet cheerily, sitting up in bed. "Bring on your nurses." Dumoise was dumb. Strickland led him out and explained that there must have been a mistake in the diagnosis. Dumoise remained dumb, and left the house hastily. He considered that his professional reputation had been injured, and was inclined to make a personal matter of the recovery. Strickland went out too. When he came back, he said that he had been to call on the temple of Hanuman to offer redress for the pollution of the god, and had been solemnly assured that no white man had ever touched the idol, and that he was an incarnation of all the virtues laboring under a delusion. "What do you think?" said Strickland. I said, "There are more things—" But Strickland hates that quotation. He says that I have worn it threadbare. One other curious thing happened which frightened me as much as anything in all the night's work. When Fleet was dressed he came into the dining room and sniffed. He had a quaint trick of moving his nose when he sniffed. "Horrid doggy smell here," said he. "You should really keep those terriers of yours in better order. Try sulphur, Strick." But Strickland did not answer. He caught hold of the back of a chair, and, without warning, went into an amazing fit of hysterics. It is terrible to see a strong man overtaken with hysteria. Then it struck me that we had fought for Fleet's soul with the silver man in that room, and had disgraced ourselves as Englishmen forever. And I laughed and gasped and gurgled just as shamefully as Strickland, while Fleet thought that we had both gone mad. We never told him what we had done. Some years later, when Strickland had married and was a church-going member of society for his wife's sake, we reviewed the incident dispassionately, and Strickland suggested that I should put it before the public. I cannot myself see that this step is likely to clear up the mystery, because, in the first place, no one will believe a rather unpleasant story, and, in the second, it is well known to every right-minded man that the gods of the heathen are stone and brass, and any attempt to deal with them otherwise is justly condemned. End of The Mark of the Beast by Rudyard Kipling.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mother and the Dead Child by Hans Andersen. A mother sat by her little child. She was very sorrowful and feared that it would die. Its little face was pale and its eyes were closed. The child drew its breath with difficulty, and sometimes so deeply as if it were sighing, and then the mother looked more sorrowfully than before on the little creature. Then there was a knock at the door, and a poor old man came in, wrapped up in something that looked like a great horsecloth, for that keeps warm. And he required it, for it was cold winter. Without, everything was covered with ice and snow, and the wind blew so sharply that it cut one's face. And as the old man trembled with cold, and the little child was quiet for a moment, the mother went and put some beer on the stove in a little pot to warm it for him. The old man sat down and rocked the cradle, and the mother seated herself on an old chair by him, looked at her sick child that drew its breath so painfully, and seized the little hand. "You think I shall keep it, do you not?" she asked. "The good God will not take it from me." And the old man, he was Death, nodded in such a strange way that it might just as well mean yes as no. And the mother cast down her eyes, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Her head became heavy. For 3 days and 3 nights she had not closed her eyes, and now she slept, but only for a minute. Then she started up and shivered with cold. "What is that?" she asked, and looked round on all sides. But the old man was gone, and her little child was gone. He had taken it with him. And there in the corner the old clock was humming and whirring. The heavy laden weight ran down to the floor. Plump! And the clock stopped. But the poor mother rushed out of the house crying for her child. Out in the snow sat a woman in long black garments, and she said, "Death has been with you in your room. I saw him hasten away with your child. He strides faster than the wind, and never brings back what he has taken away." "Only tell me which way he has gone," said the mother. "Tell me the way, and I will find him." "I know him," said the woman in the black garments, "but before I tell you, you must sing me all the songs that you have sung to your child. I love those songs. I have heard them before. I am Night, and I saw your tears when you sang them." "I will sing them all," said the mother, "but do not detain me, that I may overtake him and find my child." But Night sat dumb and still. Then the mother wrung her hands and sang and wept. And there were many songs, but yet more tears, and then Night said, "Go to the right into the dark fir wood, for I saw Death take that path with your little child." Deep in the forest there was a cross road, and she did not know which way to take. There stood a blackthorn bush, with not a leaf nor a blossom upon it, for it was in the cold winter time, and icicles hung from the twigs. "Have you not seen Death go by with my little child?" "Yes," replied the bush, "but I shall not tell you which way he went unless you warm me on your bosom. I'm freezing to death here, I'm turning to ice." And she pressed the blackthorn bush to her bosom, quite close, that it might be well warmed. And the thorns pierced into her flesh, and her blood oozed out in great drops. But the blackthorn shot out fresh green leaves, and blossomed in the dark winter night. So warm is the heart of a sorrowing mother. And the blackthorn bush told her the way that she should go. Then she came to a great lake, on which there was neither ship nor boat. The lake was not frozen enough to carry her, nor sufficiently open to allow her to wade through, and yet she must cross it if she was to find her child. Then she laid herself down to drink the lake, and that was impossible for anyone to do. But the sorrowing mother thought that perhaps a miracle might be wrought. "No, that can never succeed," said the lake. "Let us rather see how we can agree. I'm fond of collecting pearls, and your eyes are the 2 clearest I have ever seen. If you will weep them out into me, I will carry you over into the great greenhouse where Death lives and cultivates flowers and trees. Each of these is a human life." "Oh, what I would not give to get my child," said the afflicted mother, and she wept yet more, and her eyes fell into the depths of the lake and became 2 costly pearls. But the lake lifted her up as if she sat in a swing, and she was wafted to the opposite shore, where stood a wonderful house, miles in length. One could not tell if it was a mountain containing forests and caves, or a place that had been built. But the poor mother could not see it, for she had wept her eyes out. "Where shall I find Death, who went away with my child?" she asked. "He is not arrived here yet," said an old gray-haired woman who was going about watching the hothouse of Death. "How have you found your way here, and who helped you?" "The good God has helped me," she replied. "He is merciful, and you will be merciful too. Where shall I find my little child?" "I do not know it," said the old woman, "and you cannot see. Many flowers and trees have faded this night, and death will soon come and transplant them. You know very well that every human being has his tree of life or his flower of life, just as each is arranged. They look like other plants, but their hearts beat. Children's hearts can beat too. Think of this. Perhaps you may recognize the beating of your child's heart. But what will you give me if I tell you what more you must do? I have nothing more to give, said the afflicted mother, but I will go for you to the ends of the earth. I have nothing for you to do there, said the old woman, but you can give me your long black hair. You must know yourself that it is beautiful, and it pleases me. You can take my white hair for it, and that is always something. Do you ask for nothing more? Asked she. I will give you that gladly. And she gave her beautiful hair, and received in exchange the old woman's white hair. And then they went into the great hot house of death, where flowers and trees were growing marvelously intertwined. There stood the fine hyacinths under glass bells, some quite fresh, others somewhat sickly. Water snakes were twining about them, and black crabs clung tightly to the stalks. There stood gallant palm trees, oaks and plantains, and parsley in blooming time. Each tree and flower had its name. Each was a human life. The people were still alive, one in China, another in Greenland, scattered about in the world. There were great trees thrust into little pots, so that they stood quite crowded, and they were nearly bursting the pots. There was also many a little weakly flower in rich earth, with moss around it, cared for and tended. But the sorrowful mother bent down over all the smallest plants, and heard the human heart beating in each, and out of millions she recognized that of her child. "That is it!" she cried, and stretched out her hands over a little crocus flower, which hung down quite sick and pale. "Do not touch the flower," said the old dame, "but place yourself here, and when death comes, I expect him every minute, then don't let him pull up the plant, but threaten him that you will do the same to all the other plants. Then he'll be frightened. He has to account for them all. Not one may be pulled up till he receives commission from heaven." And all at once there was an icy cold rush through the hall, and the blind mother felt that death was arriving. "How did you find your way hither?" said he. "How have you been able to come quicker than I?" "I am a mother," she answered. And Death stretched out his long hands towards the little delicate flower. But she kept her hands tight about it and held it fast, and yet she was full of anxious care lest he should touch one of the leaves. Then Death breathed upon her hands, and she felt that his breath was colder than the icy wind, and her hands sank down powerless. "You can do nothing against me," said Death. "But the merciful God can," she replied. "I only do what he commands," said Death. "I am his gardener. I take all his trees and flowers and transport them into the great paradise gardens in the unknown land. But how they will flourish there, and how it is there, I may not tell you." "Give me back my child," said the mother, and she implored and wept. All at once she grasped two pretty flowers with her two hands, and called to Death, "I'll tear off all your flowers, for I am in despair." "Do not touch them," said Death. "You say you are so unhappy, and now you would make another mother just as unhappy?" "Another mother?" said the poor woman, and she let the flowers go. "There are your eyes for you," said Death. "I have fished them out of the lake. They gleamed up quite brightly. I did not know that they were yours. Take them back. They are clearer now than before. And then look down into the deep well close by. I will tell you the names of the two flowers you wanted to pull up, and you will see what you were about to frustrate and destroy." And she looked down into the well, and it was a happiness to see how one of them became a blessing to the world, how much joy and gladness she diffused around her. And the woman looked at the life of the other, and it was made up of care and poverty, misery and woe. Both are the will of God, said Death. Which of them is the flower of misfortune, and which the blessed one? She asked. That I may not tell you, answered Death. But this much you shall hear, that one of these two flowers is that of your child. It was the fate of your child that you saw, the future of your own child. Then the mother screamed aloud for terror. Which of them belongs to my child? Tell me that. Release the innocent child. Let my child free from all that misery. Rather carry it away, carry it into God's kingdom. Forget my tears, forget my entreaties, and all that I have done. I do not understand you, said Death. Will you have your child back, or shall I carry it to that place you know not? Then the mother wrung her hands, and fell on her knees, and prayed to the good God. Hear me not when I pray against thy will, which is at all times the best. Hear me not, hear me not! And she let her head sink down on her bosom. And Death went away with her child into the unknown land. End of The Mother and the Dead Child by Hans Andersen. Read by Scott Bush.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nyarlathotep by H.P. Lovecraft. Recorded on November 19, 2006 by Kevin Dole 2. myspace.com/KevinDole2. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, I am the last, I will tell the audient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing, such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces, and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demoniac alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood, and looked like a pharaoh. The fellaheen knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal, and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep, and shuddered. And where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on green waters gliding under bridges, and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him, and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said they were horrible and impressive beyond my most fevered imaginings, and what was thrown on the screen in the darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dared prophesy, and in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet which showed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, through the stifling night and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on a screen I saw hooded forms amidst ruins, and yellow evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments, and I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood up on end, while shadows more grotesque than I can tell came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drove us all out, down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I could never be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. We swore to one another that the city was exactly the same, and still alive. And when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again, and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious involuntary marching formations, and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to show where the tramways had run. And again we saw a tram-car, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked toward the open country, and presently I felt a chill which was not of the hot autumn. For as we stalked out on the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon-glitter of evil snows, trackless, inexplicable snows, swept asunder in one direction only, where lay a gulf all the blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished, but my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation, corpses of dead worlds with sores that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the worlds, vague ghosts of monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, the detestable pounding and piping whereunto dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly the gigantic, tenebrous, ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep. End of recording.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recorded by me, Glenn Hallstrom, also known as Smokestack Jones. smokestackjones@gmail.com. You'll also find my blog at toomuchjohnson.blogspot.com. The Terrible Old Man by H.P. Lovecraft. It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joe Sasnak and Manuel Silva to call on the Terrible Old Man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house on Water Street near the sea, and is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the profession of Messrs. Ricky, Sasnak, and Silva, for that profession was nothing less dignified than robbery. The inhabitants of Kingsport say and think many things about the terrible old man, which generally keep him safe from the attention of gentlemen like Mr. Ricky and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is in truth a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few knew his real name. Among the gnarled trees in his front yard of his aged and neglected place he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted so that they resemble the idols of some obscure Eastern temple. The collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white hair and beard, or to break into the small paned windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles. But there are other things which frighten the older and more curious folk, who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. These folks say that on a table in a large bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles, in each a small piece of lead suspended pendulum-wise from a string, and they say that the terrible old man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and whenever he speaks to a bottle, the little lead pendulum within makes certain definite vibrations, as if in answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angela Ricky and Joe Sasnak and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport blood. They were of that new and heterogeneous alien stock which lies outside the charmed circle of New England life and traditions, and they saw in the terrible old man merely a tottering, almost helpless graybeard, who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry in their way for the lonely, unpopular old fellow, whom everybody shunned, and at whom the dogs barked singularly. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man who has no account at the bank, and who pays for his few necessities at a village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries ago. Messrs. Ricky, Sasnak, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricky and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman, whilst Mr. Sasnak waited for them in their presumable metallic burden with a covered motor car on Ship Street, by the gate in the tall rear wall of the host's grounds. Desire to avoid needless explanations in case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for a quiet and unostentatious departure. As prearranged, the 3 adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicions afterwards. Messrs. Ricky and Silva met at Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work making the terrible old man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver, for aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, he was very old and very feeble, and there were 2 visitors. Messrs. Ricky and Silva were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble, and the screams of a weak and exceptionally vulnerable man can be easily muffled. So they moved up to the one lighted window, and heard the terrible old man talking childishly to his bottles with pendulums. Then they donned masks and knocked politely at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Sasnak as he fidgeted restlessly in the covered motor car by the terrible old man's gate on Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams that he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously he watched that narrow oaken gate on the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch, and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing where his treasure was hidden, and the thorough search became necessary? Mr. Sasnak did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread, or tapping, on the walk inside the gate, heard a gentle fumbling at the rusty latch, and saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward. And in the pallid glow of the single dim street lamp he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously. Mr. Sassenach had never before noticed the color of that man's eyes. Now he saw that they were yellow. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the 3 unidentifiable bodies horribly slashed as with many cutlasses, and horribly mangled as by the tread of many cruel boot heels, which the tide washed in. And some people even spoke of things as trivial as the deserted motor car found on Ship Street, or certain especially inhuman cries, probably of a stray animal or migratory bird, heard in the night by wakeful citizens. But in this idle village gossip the terrible old man took no interest at all. He was by nature reserved, and when one is aged and feeble, one's reserve is doubly strong. Besides, so ancient a sea captain must have witnessed scores of things much more stirring in the far-off days of his unremembered youth. The End of The Terrible Old Man by H.P. Lovecraft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recorded by me, Glenn Hallstrom, also known as Smokestack Jones. smokestackjones@gmail.com. You'll also find my blog at toomuchjohnson.blogspot.com. The Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft. Sedibus unsaltern placidus in morte requiescem. Virgil. In relating the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt of the authenticity of my narrative. It is an unfortunate fact that the bulk of humanity is too limited in its mental vision to weigh with patience and intelligence these isolated phenomena, seen and felt only by a psychologically sensitive few, which lie outside its common experience. Men of broader intellect know that there is no sharp distinction betwixt the real and the unreal, that all things appear as they do only by virtue of the delicate individual physical and mental media through which we are made conscious of them. But the prosaic materialism of the majority condemns as madness the flashes of supersight which penetrate the common veil of obvious empiricism. My name is Gervais Dudley, and from earliest childhood I have been a dreamer and a visionary. Wealthy beyond the necessity of a commercial life, and temperamentally unfitted for the formal studies and social recreations of my acquaintances, I have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world, spending my youth and adolescence in ancient and little-known books, and in roaming the fields and groves of the region near my ancestral home. I do not think that what I read in these books or saw in these fields and groves was actually what other boys read and saw there, but of this I must say little, since detailed speech would but confirm those cruel slanders upon my intellect, which I sometimes overhear from the whispers of the stealthy attendants around me. It is sufficient for me to relate events without analyzing causes. I have said that I dwelt apart from the visible world, but I have not said that I dwelt alone. There is no human creature made due for lacking the fellowship of the living. He invariably draws upon the companionship of things that are not, or are no longer living. Close by my home there lies a singular wooded hollow, in whose twilight deeps I spent most of my time, reading, thinking, and dreaming. Down its moss-covered slopes my first steps of infancy were taken, and around its grotesquely gnarled oak trees my first fancies of boyhood were woven. Well did I come to know the presiding dryads of those trees, and often have I watched their wild dances and the struggling beams of waning moon. But of these things I must not now speak. I will tell only of the lone tomb in the darkest of the hillside thickets, the deserted tomb of the Hydes, an old and exalted family whose last direct descendant had been laid within its black recesses many decades before my birth. The vault to which I refer is an ancient granite, weathered and discolored by the mists of dampness of generations. Excavated back into the hillside, the structure is visible only at the entrance. The door, a ponderous and forbidding slab of stone, hangs upon rusted iron hinges, and is fastened ajar in a queerly sinister way, by means of heavy iron chains and padlocks according to a gruesome fashion of a half-century ago. The abode of a race whose scions are inured had once crowned the declivity which holds the tomb, but had long since fallen victim to the flames which sprang up from a disastrous stroke of lightning. Of the midnight storm which destroyed this gloomy mansion, the older inhabitants of the region sometimes speak in hushed and uneasy voices, alluding to what they call divine wrath, in a manner that in later years vaguely increased the always strong fascination which I felt for the forest-darkened sepulchre. One man only had perished in the fire. When the last of the Hydes were buried in this place of shade and stillness, the sad urnful of ashes had come from a distant land, to which the family had repaired when the mansion burned down. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite portal, and few care to brave the depressing shadows which seem to linger strangely about the water-worn stones. I shall never forget the afternoon when I first stumbled upon the half-hidden house of the dead. It was in midsummer, when the alchemy of nature transmutes the sylvan landscape into one vivid and almost homogeneous mass of green, when the senses are well-nigh intoxicated with the surging seas of moist verdure and the subtly indefinable odors of the soil and vegetation. In such surroundings the mind loses its perspective. Time and space become trivial and unreal, and echoes of a forgotten prehistoric past beat incessantly upon enthralled consciousness. All day I had been wandering through the mystic groves of the hollow, thinking thoughts I need not discuss, and conversing with things I need not name. In years a child of 10, I had seen and heard many wonders unknown to the throng, and was oddly aged in certain respects, when upon forcing my way between two savage clumps of briars, I suddenly encountered the entrance to the vault. I had no knowledge of what I had discovered. The dark blocks of granite, the door so curiously ajar, and the funereal carvings above the arch, aroused in me no associations of mournful or terrible character. Of graves and tombs I knew and imagined much, but had, on account of my peculiar temperament, been kept from all personal contact with churchyards and cemeteries. The strange stone house on the woodland slope was to me only a source of interest and speculation, and its cold, damp interior, into which I vainly peered through the aperture so tantalizingly left, contained for me no hint of death or decay. But in that instant of curiosity was born the madly unreasoning desire which has brought me to this hell of confinement. Spurred on by a voice which must have come from the hideous soul of the forest, I resolved to enter the beckoning gloom, in spite of the ponderous chains which barred my passage. In the waning light of day I alternately rattled the rusty impediments with a view to throwing wide the stone door, and essayed to squeeze my slight form through the space already provided, but neither plan met with success. At first curious, I was not frantic, and when in the thickening twilight I returned to my home, I had sworn to the 100 gods of the grove that at any cost I would some day force an entrance into the black, chilly depths that seemed calling out to me. The physician with the iron-gray beard, who comes each day to my room, once told a visitor that this decision marked the beginnings of a pitiful monomania, but I will leave final judgment to my readers when they shall have learnt all. The months following my discovery were spent in futile attempts to force the complicated padlock of the slightly open vault, and in carefully guarded inquiries regarding the nature and history of the structure. With the traditionally receptive ears of a small boy, I learned much, although an habitual secretiveness caused me to tell no one of my information or my resolve. It is perhaps worth mentioning that I was not at all surprised or terrified on learning of the nature of the vault. My rather original ideas regarding life and death had caused me to associate the cold clay with the breathing body in a vague fashion, and I felt that the great sinister family of the burned-down mansion was in some way represented within the stone space I sought to explore. Mumbled tales of the weird rites and godless revels of bygone years in the ancient hall gave me a new and potent interest in the tomb, before whose door I would sit for hours at a time each day. Once I thrust the candle within the nearly closed entrance, but could see nothing save a flight of damp stone steps leading downward. The odor of the place repelled yet bewitched me. I felt I had known it before, in a past remote beyond all recollection, beyond even my tendency of the body I now possess. The year after I first beheld the tomb, I stumbled upon a worm-eaten translation of Plutarch's Lives in the book-filled attic of my home. Reading the life of Theseus, I was much impressed by that passage telling of the great stone beneath which the boyish hero was to find his tokens of destiny whenever he should become old enough to lift its enormous weight. This legend had the effect of dispelling my keenest impatience to enter the vault, for it made me feel that the time was not yet ripe. Later I told myself I should grow to a strength and ingenuity which might enable me to unfasten the heavily chained door with ease, but until then I would do better by conforming to what seemed to be the will of fate. Accordingly, my watches by the dank portal became less persistent, and much of my time was spent in other, though equally strange pursuits. I would sometimes rise very quietly in the night, stealing out to walk in those churchyards and places of burial from which I had been kept by my parents. What I did there I may not say, for I am not now sure of the reality of certain things, but I know that on the day after such a nocturnal ramble, I would often astonish those about me with my knowledge of topics almost forgotten for many generations. It was after a night like that I shocked the community with a queer conceit about the burial of the rich and celebrated Squire Brewster, a maker of local history who was interred in 1711, and whose slate headstone, bearing a graven skull and crossbones, was slowly crumbling into powder. In a moment of childish imagination, I vowed not only that the undertaker, Goodman Simpson, had stolen the silver-buckled shoes, silken hose, and satin small-clothes of the deceased before burial, but that the squire himself, not fully inanimate, had turned twice in his mound-covered coffin on the day of interment. But the idea of entering the tomb never left my thoughts, being indeed stimulated by the unexpected genealogical discovery that my own maternal ancestry possessed at least a slight link with the supposedly extinct family of the Hydes. Last of my paternal race, I was likewise the last of this older and more mysterious line. I began to feel that the tomb was mine, and to look forward with hot eagerness to the time when I might pass within the stone door and down those slimy stone steps in the dark. I now formed the habit of listening very intently at the slightly open portal, choosing my favorite hours of midnight stillness for the odd vigil. By the time I came of age, I had made a small clearing in the thicket before the mold-stained facade of the hillside, allowing the surrounding vegetation to encircle and overhang the space like the walls and roof of sylvan bower. This bower was my temple, the fastened door my shrine, and here I would lie outstretched on the mossy ground, thinking strange thoughts and dreaming of strange dreams. The night of the first revelation was a sultry one. I must have fallen asleep from fatigue, for it was with a distinct sense of awakening that I heard the voices. Of those tones and accents I hesitate to speak. Of their quality I will not speak. But I may say that they presented certain uncanny differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and mode of utterance. Every shade of the New England dialect, from the uncouth syllables of the Puritan colonists to the precise rhetoric of 50 years ago, seemed represented in that shadowy colloquy, though it was only later that I noticed the fact. At any time, indeed, my attention was distracted from this matter by another phenomenon, a phenomenon so fleeting that I could not take oath upon its reality. I barely fancied, as I awoke, a light had been hurriedly extinguished within the sunken sepulchre. I do not think I was either astounded or panic-stricken, but I know that I was greatly and permanently changed that night. Upon returning home, I went with much directness to a rotting chest in the attic, wherein I found the key, which next day unlocked with ease the barrier I had so long stormed in vain. It was in the soft glow of late afternoon when I first entered the vault on the abandoned slope. A spell was upon me, and my heart leapt with an exultation I can but ill describe. As I closed the door behind me and descended the dripping steps by the light of my lone candle, I seemed to know the way. And though the candle sputtered with the stifling reek of the place, I felt singularly at home in the musty charnel house air. Looking about me, I beheld many marble slabs bearing coffins or the remains of coffins. Some of these were sealed and intact, but others had nearly vanished, leaving the silver handles and plates isolated amidst certain curious leaps of whitish dust. Upon one plate I read the name of Sir Geoffrey Hyde, who had come from Sussex in 1640 and died here a few years later. In a conspicuous alcove was one fairly well preserved and untenanted casket, adorned with a single name which brought to me both a smile and a shudder. An odd impulse caused me to climb upon the broad slab, extinguish my candle, and lie down within the vacant box. In the gray light of dawn, I staggered from the vault and locked the chain of the door behind me. I was no longer a young man, though but 21 winters had chilled my bodily frame. Early rising villagers who had observed my homeward progress looked at me strangely and marveled at the signs of ribald revelry which they saw in one whose life was known to be sober and solitary. I did not appear before my parents until after a long and refreshing sleep. Henceforth I haunted the tomb each night, seeing, hearing, and doing things I must never reveal. My speech, always susceptible to environmental influences, was the first thing to succumb to the change, and my suddenly acquired archaism of diction was soon remarked upon. Later, a queer boldness and recklessness came into my demeanor, till I unconsciously grew to possess the bearing of a man of the world, despite my lifelong seclusion. My formerly silent tongue waxed voluble with the easy grace of a Chesterfield or the godless cynicism of a Rochester. I displayed a particular erudition, utterly unlike the fantastic monkish lore over which I had pored in youth, and covered the fly-leaves of my books with facile impromptu epigrams which brought up suggestions of Gay, Prior, and the sprightliest of Augustan wits and rhymesters. One morning at breakfast I came close to disaster by declaiming in palpably liquorish accents an effusion of 18th-century bacchanalian mirth. A bit of Georgian playfulness, never recorded in a book, which ran something like this: "Come hither, my lads, with your tankards of ale, and drink to the present before it shall fail. Pile each on your platter a mountain of beef, for 'tis eating and drinking that bring us relief. So fill up your glass, so life will soon pass. When you're dead, ye'll ne'er drink to your king or your lass. Anacreon had a red rose, so they say, but what's a red rose if you're happy and gay? Gad split me, I'd rather be red whilst I'm here than white as a lily and dead half a year. So Betty, my miss, come give me a kiss. In hell there's no innkeeper's daughter like this. Young Harry, propped up as straight as he's able, will soon lose his wig and slip under the table. But fill up your goblets and pass them around, better under the table than under the ground. So revel and chaff, as ye thirstily quaff, under 6 feet of dirt 'tis less easy to laugh. The fiends strike me blue, I'm scarce able to walk, and damn me if I can stand upright or talk. Here, landlord, bid Betty to summon a chair. I'll try home for a while, for my wife is not there. So lend me a hand, I'm not able to stand, but I'm gay whilst I linger on top of the land." About this time I conceived my present fear of fire and thunderstorms. Previously indifferent to such things, I had now an unspeakable horror of them, and I would retire to the innermost recesses of the house whenever the heavens threatened an electrical display. A favorite haunt of mine during the day was a ruined cellar in the mansion that had burned down, and in fancy I would picture the structure as it had been in its prime. On one occasion I startled a villager by leading him confidently to the shallow sub-cellar, of whose existence I seemed to know, in spite of the fact that it had been unseen and forgotten for many generations. At last came that which I had long feared. My parents, alarmed at the altered manner and appearance of their only son, commenced to exert over my movements a kindly espionage which threatened to result in disaster. I had told no one of my visits to the tomb, having guarded my secret purpose with religious zeal since childhood. But now I was forced to exercise care in threading the mazes of the wooded hollow, that I might throw off a possible pursuer. My key to the vault I kept suspended from a cord about my neck, its presence known only to me. I never carried out of the sepulchre any of the things I came upon whilst within its walls. One morning, as I emerged from the damp tomb and fastened the chain of the portal with no too steady hand, I beheld an adjacent thicket the dreaded face of a watcher. Surely the end was near, for my bower was discovered, and the objective of my nocturnal journeys revealed. The man did not accost me, so I hastened home in an effort to overhear what he might report to my careworn father. Were my sojourns beyond the chain door about to be proclaimed to the world? Imagine my delighted astonishment on hearing the spy inform my parent in cautious whisper that I had spent the night in the bower outside the tomb. My sleep-filmed eyes fixed upon the crevice where the padlocked portal stood ajar. By what miracle had the watcher thus been deluded? I was now convinced that a supernatural agency protected me. Made bold by this heaven-sent circumstance, I began to resume perfect openness in going to the vault, confident that no one could witness my entrance. For a week I tasted to the full the joys of that charnel conviviality which I must not describe, when the thing happened, and I was borne away to this accursed abode of sorrow and monotony. I should not have ventured out that night, for the taint of thunder was in the clouds, and the hellish phosphorescence rose from the rank swamp at the bottom of the hollow. The call of the dead, too, was different. Instead of the hillside tomb, it was the charred cellar on the crest of the slope, whose presiding demon beckoned me with unseen fingers. As I emerged from an intervening grove upon the plain before the ruin, I beheld in the misty moonlight a thing I had always vaguely expected. The mansion, gone for a century, once more reared its stately height to the raptured vision, every window ablaze with the splendor of many candles. Up along the drive rolled the coaches of the Boston gentry, whilst on foot came a numerous assemblage of powdered exquisites from the neighboring mansions. With this throng I mingled, though I knew I belonged with the hosts rather than the guests. Inside the hall were music, laughter, and wine on every hand. Several faces I recognized, although I should have known them better had they been shriveled or eaten away by death and decomposition. Amidst a wild and reckless throng, I was the wildest and most abandoned. Gay blasphemy poured in torrents from my lips, and in my shocking sallies I heeded no law of God, man, or nature. Suddenly, a peal of thunder, resonant even above the din of the swinish revelry, clave the very roof and laid a hush of fear upon the boisterous company. Red tongues of flame and searing gusts of heat engulfed the house, and the roisterers, struck with terror at the descent of a calamity which seemed to transcend the bounds of unguided nature, fled streaking into the night. I alone remained, riveted to my seat by a groveling fear which I had never felt before. And then a second horror took possession of my soul. Burnt alive to ashes, my body dispersed by the four winds, I might never lie in the tomb of Hydes. Was not my coffin prepared for me? Had I not a right to rest until eternity among the descendants of Sir Geoffrey Hyde? I would claim my heritage of death, even though my soul goes seeking through the ages for another corporeal tenement to represent it. On that vacant slab in the alcove of the vault, Gervais Hyde would never share the sad fate of Palinurus. As the phantom of the burning house faded, I found myself screaming and struggling madly in the arms of two men, one of whom was the spy who had followed me to the tomb. Rain was pouring down in torrents, and upon the southern horizon were flashes of the lightning that had so lately passed over our heads. My father, his face lined with sorrow, stood by as I shouted my demands to be laid within the tomb. frequently admonishing my captors to treat me as gently as they could. A blackened circle on the floor of the ruined cellar told of a violent stroke from the heavens, and from this spot a group of curious villagers with lanterns were prying a small box of antique workmanship which the thunderbolt had brought to light. Ceasing my futile and now objectless writhing, I watched the spectators as they viewed the treasure trove, and was permitted to share of their discoveries. The box, whose fastenings were broken by the stroke which had unearthed it, contained many papers and objects of value, but I had eyes for one thing alone. It was the porcelain miniature of a young man in a smartly curled bagwig, and bore the initials J.H. The face was such that as I gazed I might well have been studying my mirror. On the following day I was brought to this room with the barred windows, but I have been kept informed of certain things through an aged and simple-minded servitor, for whom I bore a fondness in infancy, and who, like me, loves the churchyard. What I have dared to relate of my experiences within this vault has brought me only pitying smiles. My father, who visits me frequently, declares that at no time did I pass the chained portal, and swears that the rusted padlock had not been touched for 50 years when he examined it. He even says that all the village knew of my journeys to the tomb, and that I was often watched as I slept in the bower outside the grim facade, my half-opened eyes fixed on the crevice that leads into the interior. Against these assertions I have no tangible proof to offer, since my key to the padlock was lost in the struggle on the night of horrors. The strange things of the past which I learnt during these nocturnal meetings with the dead he dismisses as the fruits of my lifelong and omnivorous browsing among the ancient volumes of the family library. Had it not been for my old servant Hiram, I should have by this time become quite convinced of my madness. But Hiram, loyal to the last, has held faith in me, and has done that which impels me to make public at least part of my story. A week ago he burst open the lock which chains the door to the tomb perpetually ajar, and descended with a lantern into the murky depths. On a slab in an alcove he found an old but empty coffin, whose tarnished plate bears the single word Gervais. In that coffin, and in that vault, they have promised me I shall be buried. The End of the Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft.